Good morning. My name is Jen Silverstone, and I'm from the DC field office. Before we begin our content today, we have a few quick scheduling announcements. First of all, this conference, as you know, is being held in Mountain Standard Time. Today's class will end by 12:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This is the schedule and adjustment. And that is when the lunch time will begin. Of course, we know that you're joining us from all over the country, and we're happy to see you today. So if you have to eat or take a break or whatever, you do what you need to do. But formally, the lunch break will start at 12:30 p.m. We ask that you return from lunch by 1:15 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. At that time, you'll enter the tile meeting with the national president, and you'll hear from our national president, Tony Reardon, as he answers your questions and talks to you about what's most up to date on CBP issues. So again, I'll repeat the schedule change. We will conclude this course by 12:30 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. That will be a 45-minute lunch break till 1:15 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, and at that time you'll enter a new tile that's been added, meeting with the national president. And now some introductions. My name is Jen Silverstone. I've worked at NTEU for about 9 years. I come from a family of union members. The union brought my parents and my grandparents all of their benefits. I'm so happy to be part of the labor movement. And I work in the DC field office. It's my job to help chapters litigate, educate, counsel them on political and legal matters. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Samira Mungana. Samira.
Hi, everyone. I am glad to be with y'all to kick off this virtual training conference. So I have been with NTEU for 2.5 years. This is actually my first CBP training conference. I'm also excited about that. I work for NTEU because I believe in the labor movement, I believe in labor rights, and I believe in everything that you all do to, support our country and make sure that, our government functions the way that it's supposed to. And so I'm really glad to be here. I am a assistant counsel in the Oakland field office. And yeah, I think that's it. So I'm going to be going off camera now, but it's nice to be here with y'all. And I'm looking forward to this class.
Thanks, Samira. And thanks for being here to support us. So we have a lot of great content to go over today, but one of the things I'd love to do is get an idea of who we have with us. And so I'll be entering in, there are a few tabs to your right. There's a chat tab, a questions tab, a polls tab, a people tab, and a files tab. And I'm going to go over them just real quickly on how we're going to use them today. The chat tab will be if we want to ask the group a question and we want to create some discussion. That's where the question will be, in the chat tab. If you have a specific question, you're not answering a question I've posed to you, but you have a specific question about the content or a follow-up question, please drop that in the questions tab. The polls tab is where I'm going to direct you now. That's where we'll be taking some initial polls to get a sense of who's in the room. And the people tab is if you want to connect with other students or send sort of the equivalent of private messages from student to student or student to instructor. And the last tab is the files tab. That is the tab where we've uploaded the participant guide. You all should have that participant guide already, but if you don't have it handy or you don't have it printed out, you don't need to necessarily have it printed out, but just click over to that files tab and have it, because we'll be following along both a PowerPoint presentation and some of that guide. Now for the polls tab. So in the polls tab, you should be able to see a tab in just a moment. And the first question we want to know is, how long have you been a steward? And I will give you 2 minutes to answer this poll. All right, it looks like we have quite a different spread. It's good to see that we have a lot of stewards that have joined NTEU in this leadership role in the last 6 months. It seems like just over half the class has joined in the last year. So this, just like Samira, probably is your first CBP National Training Conference. And although it's virtual, I do think that we're going to have quite a lot to teach you. You're going to learn a lot, and hopefully you're going to enjoy it the best that you can. And so I just wanted to welcome you all. What I will also say is that that means that you've onboarded during the pandemic, during all of the drama that's gone on with CBP, with weather and safety leave, non-telework issues, for certain types of uniformed positions that have telework capable issues during the pandemic. And so first of all, I just want to thank you. Thank you so much for stepping up to the plate during an incredibly challenging time for your members and probably for you personally and at work. It's, you know, without the power of our stewardship, we're very, very weak. You know, that's the fundamental belief of the labor movement and in the union, is that collective power, and together we are stronger than apart. And so in a time where many of our chapter leaders and our chapter representatives from national can't see each other as often, can't see different parts of their membership due to issues with COVID and all the complications of that, it's just incredibly important that we've seen such a large group of people step up to the plates of leadership. So I wanted to acknowledge you. For those of you with respect to been here for more than 2 years, I'm really also happy that you're joining us as well, because some of these questions are going to ask for experience. And so I'm going to lean on you, and we're dropping a question into the chat to give a real example of what's gone on in the workplace. So I'm happy to have people who are a little bit more seasoned. Some of you may have been to the stewardship track before. This class has completely been revamped, and it's the first time it's running live at CBP. So this isn't the same stewardship class you've taken before. If you've taken the stewardship track, and if you've been a steward for 2 years or more and you just never made it to CBP Vegas before, welcome, and we have a lot of good in store for you. The next poll I want to ask real quick before we dive into the content is coming live now. And it talks about what environment you're primarily working in, or who you're representing. And this just will give me some context to the types of issues you're seeing. You know, I represent multiple different environments. I represent headquarters at CBP. I also represent airport and seaport. I don't have any land border in my territory. Samira, do you have any land border in your territory?
You caught me while I had some mouth done.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No worries, no worries. No, I don't.
Yeah. So I'm pretty for.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead. Thanks for giving me some feedback. Sorry about catching you off guard. Yeah, so I'm pretty familiar with a lot of the land border issues. For purposes of this class, this doesn't make too much of a difference, but it's just good to know that you're in a group with people that are seeing issues as they arise differently. So some of the issues we see at land border, we don't see at seaports. Some of the issues that we see in non-OFO or other, if you're here as an auditor, an import specialist, you know, within the Office of Trade or otherwise, you know, we're going to try to make this content tailored to you. What's amazing about this class is that this doesn't really focus on representation. And I say that's amazing because it's your first class as national training. And most of the content of national training will be focused on the contract representational issues. So I'm sure many of you have a lot of questions and are excited to learn more about how to better your representation of your chapters. But I will say that this is a break from that. This is the class where we're going to talk about what it means to be a leader as a steward. And to that extent, it doesn't matter how long you've been a steward, where you're a steward, or what chapter you're a part of. It's just about what the embodiment of stewardship is. So we're going to dive right in. Let's move to the next slide. So we're going to quickly go over some goals of this class. There's a lot of content in this class. I will say that due to some of the limitations of this platform and the limitations of delivering this virtually, this 100% is going to be a class that what you put in is what you get out. If we ask questions in the chat and you never answer, if we ask polls and you're non-responsive, and there's going to be a lot of self-reflection, meaning that we will take small breaks and I will say, go write an answer down to this question or think about this issue. You know, the more you engage with that content, the more you're going to find this class to be impactful and powerful. So just, understand that this is for sure a class that what you put in is going to affect how you feel about what you learn. That being said, there are some overall goals. Understanding NTEU's overall structure and where you fit in. We're going to talk about a framework for positive impacts in the workplace, something you can come back to as a different tool and a different framing as you continue on your stewardship journeys, hopefully for many years to come. We're going to talk about specific communication tools that we find new stewards need and help them supporting in their roles in the workplace. We're also going to talk about key performance indicators for stewards, what makes a good steward from National's perspective. And we're going to talk about specific strategies to grow your relationships in the workplace, as relationships are the key to a lot of your success. Next slide, please. So I know you guys watched, I believe, a video this morning in your opening session, but we're actually going to watch another video, and this is a TED Talk. And I'll just ask you guys to drop in the chat. Has anybody heard of this TED Talk? Why I get it queued up. It's called Starting with Why by Simon Sinek. Drop in the chat if you've seen this or you've heard about it before. And Samir, I'll have you stop sharing. All right, I see the chat's still empty. That either means that we're still figuring out how to use the chat or no one's heard of this before. This video is pretty impactful. It's 17 minutes long. Feel free to, thanks for some of the feedback. Thanks, Ken. Thanks, Annie. Great. All right, this is good. If you've never seen this, this is a really powerful video. It's 17 minutes long. We're going to watch the whole thing together because it's just so good. I will tell you that it's kind of older. That's why I always check. It's about 12 years old now, but it still surprises me. Okay. Hey, Louise. Hi, Wesley. Nice to see you. Glad you've seen it. So for those of you who've seen it, it might be a refresher, but for those of you who haven't seen it, I hope you find it impactful, and we'll talk about why we're beginning this in a moment. So I'm going to give it a share. Enjoy. Make sure you have your sound.
Explain when things don't go as we assume, or better, how do you explain when others are able to achieve things that seem to defy all of the assumptions? For example, why is Apple so innovative? Year after year after year after year, they're more innovative than all their competition, and yet they're just a computer company. They're just like everyone else. They have the same access to the same talent, the same agencies, the same consultants, the same media. Then why is it that they seem to have something different? Why is it that Martin Luther King led the civil rights movement? He wasn't the only man who suffered in a pre-civil rights America, and he certainly wasn't the only great orator of the day. Why him? And why is it that the Wright brothers were able to figure out powered man flight when there were certainly other teams who were better qualified, better funded, and they didn't achieve powered man flight, and the Wright brothers beat them to it? There's something else at play here. About 3.5 years ago, I made a discovery, and this discovery profoundly changed my view on how I thought the world worked, and it even profoundly changed the way in which I operate in it. As it turns out, there's a pattern. As it turns out, all the great and inspiring leaders and organizations in the world, Martin Luther King or the Wright brothers, they all think, act, and communicate the exact same way, and it's the complete opposite to everyone else. All I did was codify it. And it's probably the world's simplest idea. I call it the golden circle. Why, how, what? This little idea explains why some organizations and some leaders are able to inspire where others aren't. Let me define the terms really quickly. Every single person, every single organization on the planet knows what they do, 100%. Some know how they do it, whether you call it your differentiating value proposition or your proprietary process or your USP. But very, very few people or organizations know why they do what they do. And by why, I don't mean to make a profit. That's a result. It's always a result. By why, I mean what's your purpose? What's your cause? What's your belief? Why does your organization exist? Why do you get out of bed in the morning? And why should anyone care? Well, as a result, the way we think, the way we act, the way we communicate is from the outside in. It's obvious. We go from the clearest thing to the fuzziest thing. But the inspired leaders and the inspired organizations, regardless of their size, regardless of their industry, all think, act, and communicate from the inside out. Let me give you an example. I use Apple because they're easy to understand and everybody gets it. If Apple were like everyone else, a marketing message from them might sound like this. We make great computers. They're beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. Want to buy one? Meh. And that's how most of us communicate. That's how most marketing is done, that's how most sales is done, and that's how most of us communicate interpersonally. We say what we do, we say how we're different or how we're better, and we expect some sort of behavior, a purchase, a vote, something like that. Here's our new law firm. We have the best lawyers with the biggest clients. We have, we always perform for our clients, do business with us. Here's our new car. It gets great gas mileage. It has, leather seats. Buy our car. But it's uninspiring. Here's how Apple actually communicates. Everything we do, we believe in challenging the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. The way we challenge the status quo is by making our products beautifully designed, simple to use, and user-friendly. We just happen to make great computers. Want to buy one? Totally different, right? You're ready to buy a computer from me. All I did was reverse the order of the information. What it proves to us is that people don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. This explains why every single person in this room is perfectly comfortable buying a computer from Apple. But we're also perfectly comfortable buying an MP3 player from Apple, or a phone from Apple, or a DVR from Apple. But as I said before, Apple's just a computer company. There's nothing that distinguishes them structurally from any of their competitors. Their competitors are all equally qualified to make all of these products. In fact, they tried. A few years ago, Gateway came out with flat-screen TVs. They're eminently qualified to make flat-screen TVs. They've been making flat-screen monitors for years. Nobody bought one. And Dell came out with MP3 players and PDAs. And they make great quality products, and they can make perfectly well-designed products, and nobody bought one. In fact, talking about it now, we can't even imagine buying an MP3 player from Dell. Why would you buy an MP3 player from a computer company? But we do it every day. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. The goal is not to do business with everybody who needs what you have. The goal is to do business with people who believe what you believe. Here's the best part. None of what I'm telling you is my opinion. It's all grounded in the tenets of biology, not psychology, biology. If you look at a cross-section of the human brain, looking from the top down, what you see is the human brain is actually broken into three major components that correlate perfectly with the golden circle. Our newest brain, our Homo sapien brain, our neocortex, corresponds with the what level. The neocortex is responsible for all of our rational and analytical thought and language. The middle two sections make up our limbic brains, and our limbic brains are responsible for all of our feelings, like trust and loyalty. It's also responsible for all human behavior, all decision-making, and it has no capacity for language. In other words, when we communicate from the outside in, yes, people can understand vast amounts of complicated information like features and benefits and facts and figures. It just doesn't drive behavior. When we communicate from the inside out, we're talking directly to the part of the brain that controls behavior, and then we allow people to rationalize it with the tangible things we say and do. This is where gut decisions come from. You know, sometimes you can give somebody all the facts and your figures and they say, I know what all the facts and details say, but it just doesn't feel right. Why would we use that verb? It doesn't feel right. Because the part of the brain that controls decision making doesn't control language. And the best we can muster up is, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. Or sometimes you say you're leading with your heart or you're leading with your soul. Well, I hate to break it to you, those aren't other body parts controlling your behavior. It's all happening here in your limbic brain, the part of the brain that controls decision making and not language. But if you don't know why you do what you do, and people respond to why you do what you do, then how will you ever get people to vote for you or buy something from you, or more importantly, be loyal and want to be a part of what it is that you do? Again, the goal is not just to sell people who need what you have. The goal is to sell to people who believe what you believe. The goal is not just to hire people who need a job. It's to hire people who believe what you believe. I always say that, you know, there's if you hire people just because they can do a job, they'll work for your money. But if you hire people who believe what you believe, they work for you with blood and sweat and tears. And nowhere else is there a better example of this than with the Wright brothers. Most people don't know about Samuel Pierpont Langley. And back in the early 20th century, the pursuit of powered man flight was like the .com of the day. Everybody was trying it. And Samuel Pierpont Langley had what we assume to be the recipe for success. I mean, even now you ask people, why did your product or why did your company fail? And people always give you the same permutation of the same three things. Undercapitalized, the wrong people, bad market conditions. It's always the same three things. So let's explore that. Samuel Pierpont Langley was given $50,000 by the War Department to figure out this flying machine. Money was no problem. He held a seat at Harvard and worked at the Smithsonian and was extremely well connected. He knew all the big minds of the day. He hired the best minds money could find, and the market conditions were fantastic. The New York Times followed him around everywhere, and everyone was rooting for Langley. And how come we've never heard of Samuel Pierpont Langley? A few hundred miles away in Dayton, Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright. They had none of what we consider to be the recipe for success. They had no money. They paid for their dream with the proceeds from their bicycle shop. Not a single person on the Wright brothers' team had a college education, not even Orville or Wilbur. And the New York Times followed them around nowhere. The difference was Orville and Wilbur were driven by a cause, by a purpose, by a belief. They believed that if they could figure out this flying machine, it'll change the course of the world. Samuel Pierpont Langley was different. He wanted to be rich and he wanted to be famous. He was in pursuit of the result. He was in pursuit of the riches. And lo and behold, look what happened. The people who believed in the Wright brothers' dream worked with them with blood and sweat and tears. The others just worked for the paycheck. And they tell stories of how every time the Wright brothers went out, they would have to take 5 sets of parts because that's how many times they would crash before they came in for supper. And eventually, on December 17th, 1903, the Wright brothers took flight. And no one was there to even experience it. We found out about it a few days later. And further proof that Langley was motivated by the wrong thing, the day the Wright brothers took flight, he quit. He could have said, that's an amazing discovery, guys. Now we'll improve upon your technology. But he didn't. He wasn't first. He didn't get rich. He didn't get famous. So he quit. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And if you talk about what you believe, you will attract those who believe what you believe. Well, why is it important to attract those who believe what you believe? Something called the law of diffusion of innovation. And if you don't know the law, you definitely know the terminology. The first 2.5% of our population are our innovators. The next 13.5% of our population are our early adopters. The next 34% are your early majority, your late majority, and your laggards. The only reason these people buy touch-tone phones is because you can't buy rotary phones anymore. We all sit at various places at various times on the scale, but what the law of diffusion of innovation tells us is that if you want mass market success or mass market acceptance of an idea, you cannot have it until you achieve this tipping point between 15 and 18% market penetration, and then the system tips. And I love asking businesses, what's your conversion on new business? And they love to tell you, oh, it's about 10%, proudly. Well, you can trip over 10% of the customers. We all have about 10% who just get it. That's how we describe them, right? That's like that gut feeling, oh, they just get it. The problem is, how do you find the ones that just get it before you're doing business with them versus the ones who don't get it? So it's this here, this little gap, that you have to close, as Geoffrey Moore calls it, crossing the chasm. Because you see, the early majority will not try something until someone else has tried it first. And these guys, the innovators and the early adopters, they're comfortable making those gut decisions. They're more comfortable making those intuitive decisions that are driven by what they believe about the world and not just what product is available. These are the people who stood online for 6 hours to buy an iPhone when they first came out, when you could have just walked into the store the next week and bought one off the shelf. These are the people who spent $40,000 on flat-screen TVs when they first came out, even though the technology was substandard. And by the way, they didn't do it because the technology was so great. They did it for themselves. It's because they wanted to be first. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And what you do simply proves what you believe. In fact, people will do the things that prove what they believe. The reason that person bought the iPhone in the first 6 hours, or stood in line for 6 hours, was because of what they believed about the world and how they wanted everybody to see them. They were first. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So let me give you a famous example, a famous failure and a famous success of the law of diffusion of innovation. First, the famous failure. It's a commercial example. As we said before a second ago, the recipe for success is money and the right people and the right marketing conditions, right? You should have success then. Look at TiVo. From the time TiVo came out about 8 or 9 years ago to this current day, they are the single highest quality product on the market. Hands down, there is no dispute. Well-funded, market conditions were fantastic. I mean, we use TiVo as a verb. I TiVo stuff on my piece of junk Time Warner DVR all the time. But TiVo is a commercial failure. They've never made money. And when they went IPO, their stock was at about $30 or $40 and then plummeted, and it's never traded above 10. In fact, I don't think it's even traded above 6, except for a couple of little spikes. Because you see, when TiVo launched their product, they told us all what they had. They said, we have a product that pauses live TV, skips commercials, rewinds live TV, and memorizes your viewing habits without you even asking. And the cynical majority said, we don't believe you, we don't need it, we don't like it, you're scaring us. What if they had said, if you're the kind of person who likes to have total control over every aspect of your life, boy, do we have a product for you. It pauses live TV, skips commercials, memorizes your viewing habits, etc., etc. People don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, and what you do simply serves as the proof of what you believe. Now let me give you a successful example of the law of diffusion of innovation. In the summer of 1963, 250,000 people showed up on the Mall in Washington to hear Dr. King speak. They sent out no invitations, and there was no website to check the date. How do you do that? Well, Dr. King wasn't the only man in America who was a great orator. He wasn't the only man in America who suffered in a pre-civil rights America. In fact, some of his ideas were bad, but he had a gift. He didn't go around telling people what needed to change in America. He went around and told people what he believed. I believe, I believe, I believe, he told people. And people who believed what he believed took his cause and they made it their own, and they told people. And some of those people created structures to get the word out to even more people. And lo and behold, 250,000 people showed up on the right day, on the right time to hear him speak. How many of them showed up for him? 0. They showed up for themselves. It's what they believed about America that got them to travel on a bus for 8 hours to stand in the sun in Washington in the middle of August. It's what they believed. And it wasn't about black versus white. 25% of the audience was white. Dr. King believed that there were 2 types of laws in this world, those that are made by a higher authority and those that are made by man. And not until all the laws that are made by man are consistent with the laws that are made by the higher authority will we live in a just world. It just so happens that the civil rights movement was the perfect thing to help him bring his cause to life. We followed him not for him, but for ourselves. And by the way, he gave the I have a dream speech, not the I have a plan speech. Listen to politicians now with their comprehensive 12-point plans. They're not inspiring anybody. Because there are leaders and there are those who lead. Leaders hold a position of power or authority, but those who lead inspire us. Whether they're individuals or organizations, we follow those who lead, not because we have to, but because we want to. We follow those who lead, not for them, but for ourselves. And it's those who start with why that have the ability to inspire those around them or find others who inspire them. Thank you very much.
Okay, guys. Well, hopefully you joined for all 17 minutes of that video. That I have now seen that video maybe like a lot of times because I've taught this class many times. And what I do find so fascinating about it is every time I listen to it, I hear different things. There's so much wisdom in that video, and this will be a recurring theme of this class, but I encourage you to go back to these resources for all your training resources. There's a lot of science to show that we don't learn things the first time we hear them. So I encourage you to engage with this material over again. There's a form of this class on the Virtual Training Center that you can do that, but listen to this video again when you have some more time, when you're driving to a shift. You can listen to the audio on your phone. It is so incredibly powerful. So I just want to take a few minutes now and talk a little bit more about that, get some good discussion going on in the chat before we move on from this topic. So I will ask Samira to start slide sharing again, and we'll be on slide 4, Samira. So while she's getting that pulled up, a couple quotes I wrote down during this playing of the video that I want you guys to sort of marinate on. First, the main categorization at the very end of the video is there are leaders and there are those who lead. A leader derives their sort of following from power or authority. And in my view, and you'll hear this quite a bit from National NTEU, stewards are leaders. You have authority to, use official time to raise formal issues. But what's most important about stewardship is your ability to be a leader because of your belief. In the union, whether it be a chapter issue or the labor movement in a broader scheme, meaning that your power of your leadership is how you influence your bargaining unit, how you inspire them, how you communicate with them. This video is one of the first communication tools. So I'm going to challenge you now to consider in your communication messages, whether that's to recruit a new member, whether that's to advocate for an outcome at a grievance, or whether it's talking, even as Simon goes over, interpersonally. Do you communicate from the what or the why? It's, as he says in the very beginning of the video, we normally these companies that do it this way, and this was obviously a lot of years ago, they're the ones doing it in opposite of what everyone does. Everyone goes from the outside of the golden circle to the inside. So it's pretty normal to have an introduction, something like this. My name is Jen Silverstone, and I'm an assistant counsel for the DC field. I educate and counsel, provide legal guidance to our local chapter representatives. And often when we start with the what and the how we do what we do, we never get to the why. Specifically, Samira and I started this morning with our beliefs, what brought us to the union in the greater scheme, why we work here. And so when you're communicating with your members about either an issue and why the chapter thinks this settlement is in their favor, or why NTEU National made a deal that, or won a case or argued a case a certain way, consider if you're starting with the what or the why. Because we know that the why, and this is what Simon's talking about, the social science and the psychology behind it, is that a why has the ability to build belief. The other thing I wanted to also consider that he mentioned is what you do proves what you believe. And this is a really important part of this class we're going to talk to you a little bit later about, which is, what makes a great steward is both perception and performance of that steward, what the steward actually does mechanically with the contract and representational issues. Like I said, most of this national training is targeted at that. But the perception of what you're doing and why you're doing it is incredibly important as you are the face of this union, both nationally and locally, especially in your work environment, especially interfacing with employees every day. So having some awareness and some intention behind how you're acting in this capacity is a fundamental part of this course. The other thing I wanted you to consider is that he also essentially talks about motivation. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this, but being a steward is incredibly challenging. It can be quite rewarding, especially when you have a favorable outcome. But there will be many times in your stewardship where you don't have a favorable outcome. You don't get a settlement for an employee. You don't win a grievance. National NTEU loses a case. And it can be taxing on employees with these duties, as obviously collateral duties. You're all volunteers. I know that, you know that. So it's really important to consider what your why is and to consider how it motivates you. So I'll ask Samir to move to the next slide. So I want to take now, let's take 6 minutes. My clock says 9:09 Mountain Time. Let's take till 9:15 Mountain Time. No, just turn to 10, but so 5 minutes. And I want you to answer this question in the chat, and I'll drop it in. But I want to hear why you became a steward, or why you're still a steward, or what about this role keeps you motivated. And I'm going to drop that question in the chat now. And especially those of you with a little bit more experience, I'd love to hear from you. And I'll give you guys 5 minutes because I really want you to think about it. I don't want you just to drop in an answer. I want you to spend some time reflecting on what brought you to stewardship, and if it's different or the same to why you're still a steward and why you hope to continue to be a steward. And this is your why, your personal why for stepping into this leadership role. And again, as you're reflecting, thank you, Payman. Standing up for the little guy. That's great. I think that's a common theme, right? Collective voice. I love your answer, Robin, right? So you know that you've faced challenges on the job and that this is a way you can help others. Yes, I love your response, Lisa, about building relationships with managers and employees to improve essentially what the quality of work life. Yes, Wesley's bringing up bullying. I really appreciate that as well, right? Accountability, giving power to those who are put at the whim of management bullies. This is great. Yeah, Cliff and Scott are just talking about fairness and respect, you know, NTEU's mission will go over this, but it hinges on those principles. So I appreciate those answers. Yes, Supreme. What a great name, Supreme. To be the bridge and the voice. I love that. Yeah, what I really love about so many of these answers, I'm just going to scroll through and see if anything else is adding. I appreciate all the thoughtful responses. I wish we could all be in person to have these discussions, but this is a close second. So I appreciate you guys taking the time to write some pensive thoughts. We'll have 2 more minutes for this chat response. Let me see if there's anything else I want to bring up as I scroll through your responses. Yeah, I love some of these responses. I identify with your response, Brandon, about having family lineage from union workers. So that speaks to me for sure. And, you know, a lot of you guys are talking about balance and relationship building and bridge building. So I'm glad to hear that because the end of this class is the end for a lot of reasons when we go over the agenda and sort of the overview of the course. But I will say that, in my opinion, the most valuable content is at the end of this course about relationship building. So for those of you really looking and seeing that as your why, make sure you pay special attention as we go over about the last 45 minutes of content. Yes, these are all amazing responses. Thank you so much for all the meaningful answers. I think that at the end of the day, you know, Samir, I'll have you move to the next slide now. Some of the answers that you guys, and I encourage you guys to look at your colleagues' answers, you know, be inspired by each other. You know, something that I think that Simon really gets right is, you know, part of your role as a steward is being a leader for those who don't want to speak up or fear retaliation. Some of those comments you guys put in the chat. But what it also is your responsibility as a leader to inspire others to consider this type of role. You won't be a steward forever. You may take on other union leadership roles or not, but we need a sustainable representation in your chapter. So having these conversations about your why with your members is really important because you never know sort of who you'll inspire to consider stewardship. Some of you probably were asked directly to be stewards. Some of you might have volunteered. You may have had prior experience, but it's important to realize that your presence, your being, and your motivation for being a steward is one of the most powerful communication tools that we often don't get to. Often we don't take the time to explain to a member why you became a steward. You're just there to help their problem. But I would challenge you to reconsider that and to consider putting your why up front into most of your conversations and relationship building. But generally, these are the types of answers we hear if you're looking at the slide now. We hear that people want to make it different. They believe in the concept of union work. They want to help others. The union helped me, so I want to give back. Low morale and effectiveness, lack of inclusion. They don't feel like their issues are being heard or certain employees, groups of employees' issues are not being heard. They've seen how management can candidly is pretty ineffectual in the way they handle change or initiate change. And they see that their managers aren't leading in a way that inspires them. So employees start to essentially lead themselves. Overall, though, we can pretty easily summarize these as saying that these are all areas of positive impact. Nobody comes to stewardship wanting to make things worse. Everybody has a slightly different story and a slightly different priority. But regardless of which one of these reasons in the chat or your own or on the slide resonate with you most, this is our collective why, is that people in the labor movement, all of you leaders in the labor movement, want to make positive change in the workplace to make it a better, safer place to work with more dignity and respect. And so it's important to keep that top of mind and center of heart, especially as this job gets challenging, especially as you feel defeated. So I'll encourage you, especially if you have right now, on your why, you can write a few words, you can write exactly what you put in the chat on a Post-it or a small piece of paper. Put it somewhere visible, put it where you do your union work, put it in your wallet, put it where you know, on your nightstand, whatever is meaningful for you, but make it visible and remind yourself often why you're doing this, because at times this job will burn you out. At times you'll feel defeated, and it's your intrinsic motivation for what brought you to this role that will keep sort of the fire, you know, stoked and building. So yeah, take a few minutes and really do that, because a lot of people say, oh, I'll do that later. And then of course, like, that never gets done. So take a few minutes and do that. I'm going to just scan to see if there was anything else in the chat I wanted to go over. So many new responses in the chat, so I appreciate those. I love what John Hubert said. People in management forget where they started, where they came from. So many managers start in the bargaining unit. And then by the time they reach a level of leadership of port director or whatever, ADFO, it's like they can't identify with the issues at the bottom. So I think that's really good to point out that that's part of how you bridge this gap, is building empathy with management for the plight that you're sort of trying to address, whatever that issue is. Okay, so moving right along, we started with our why, just like Simon. So now we're going to move into our who, which is a slightly different one, who we are at National. Most of you are probably familiar with some of this stuff, and due to the scheduling change, we're going to move pretty quickly through it. So Samira, I'll have you move to the next slide, but I just want to give you a brief overview of where you sit in the organizational structure. So this is a little bit hard to see, at least on my screen, because the print is pretty small, but I'll just briefly go over it. We have our executive office. Those are elected leaders. That's National President Tony Reardon, who you'll hear from at 1:15 Mountain Time, and Executive Vice President, National Executive Vice President Jim Bailey. We also have field operations and organizing. That's the one on the far left with the number of drop boxes being the longest. That's the field office. That's where I work out of DC, in the DC territory. Samira works out of Oakland. We're essentially the most important, relevant contact for stewards at National. Of course, you should always raise things through your chapter first. Different chapters have different structures, but definitely if you have a question, raise it to your chief steward. And or your president, and then from there, they often reach out to the national representative if they need some support. But you should see across the board, there's 5 other departments. Legislation handles all of our lobbying work, from everything from, coronavirus relief to getting new funding for agricultural specialists and officers in the last few years, to the up staff. Office of General Counsel, this is where a lot of our litigation happens at the federal level. So if a grievance is appealed to the federal issue, they handle overtime issues. They handle, lots of different federal issues. For CBP, they handled a lot of the litigation several years ago. Even if you're a newer steward and you were around for a few years, there was a lot of missed overtime issues from essentially like 2006 to or 2001 to 2011. They handled all that litigation at the federal level. We have our Department of Operations and Administration. That's mostly our internal department. That's like a library. That's Mark Faraday. He organizes our training conferences. You may be familiar with him. Our internal IT department. PR, they're the people who put out all the publications that you read. And sometimes they work locally with chapters on stories. Many of you may have been aware if there was a particular seizure or a particular issue at your port, NTEU may have had a story on it for our bulletin or our news publications. And the negotiation department, your national negotiators, Ryan Soon, and they handle contract negotiations. And currently your contract is not open and won't be open for a few years. So it's a pretty stable situation right now. Moving briefly along, we're gonna pop through the next few slides. So next slide, please. Tony and Jim, negotiations. No, you can keep going. Negotiations is the department we were talking about. OGC, this is the FLSA department. Yep, you can keep going. Just slow moving. Yeah, legislation. This is where you may work with local congressional offices, voter registration drives in an election year. Next slide. Public relations, like I said, news stories, PR campaigns. This is the people who creates different flyers we have for CBP wide issues. Next slide. Operations, this is again, mostly on the technical issues. Next slide. And then this is the most important one. We have 8 field offices around the country. They're in Hoboken. There are 2 in DC, Atlanta, Chicago, Austin, Denver, and Oakland. And this is basically the most important person. So if you don't know who your field rep is, or your assistant counsel is another word we use for the field rep position, definitely make a to-do that you get that person's contact information after this training, because that is the person you'll have the most questions for. And if they need to send you to another department or get an answer from someone else, they will. All right. So moving on, that's the who we are, where we are in the NTEU family at the national level. And now we're going to talk a little bit about our members. Obviously, this is a CBP-wide conference, but it's just really important you understand that we represent 32 other federal agencies. We represent a lot of bank examiners. Obviously, you guys are law enforcement. You're not our only law enforcement unit. We represent IT specialists, doctors, scientists, researchers. So CBP is one of our largest units across the nation, but we represent quite a bit of other employees, about 130,000 other employees. So this is just to give you some context to that. And now we're going to dive into our mission. I alluded to it earlier. Next slide, please. But our mission is to organize federal employees to ensure that every federal employee is treated with dignity and respect. And this is our mission. This is something that may resonate with you with your why. Obviously, I know from my experience, and I have no doubt from your experience, that we don't see this happen often at CBP at the local level. There's a lot of issues with not treating employees with respect, and a lot of issues with not sort of treating employees with dignity and fairness. And of course, a lot of that has been put under hyper scrutiny with the way weather and safety leave was handled and some of the other issues during the pandemic. But it's important you understand this is our what. So again, we often talk about a mission, but that's not our why, that's our what we do. The why is what we talked about earlier with collective action. Next slide, please. We talked about this. There's 150,000 employees that we represent across 33 departments and agencies. And so now, I want to talk a little bit about the word steward. It's something that often when we are training or working with new stewards, we just dive right in and say, do you want to be a steward? But a steward is a term of art. It's a term of art in the labor movement. But it has its roots in this idea that you're the stewards of the mission. So there's this like nice little infographic, right? But if you've ever seen the Titanic like me when I was a young child, or you've ever taken a trip, you know that stewards are people who take care of the passengers on a vessel. And so it's important that you sort of orient to your responsibility is to look after the people in your bargaining unit. Of course, that makes sure making sure they're afforded dignity and respect. Sometimes that's being the bridge. Sometimes that's standing up for them in protection of retaliation. But I want you to understand that when you're a steward, it's that you've been given charge to look after the employees that are in your area. And that word has real meaning in context. It's not just a made up word that no one really uses, in common language. Next slide, please. Oh, look at that little animation. That's pretty cool. So moving on, we've now gone over why we do what we do, who we are, and what we do our mission. So let's talk about what Simon doesn't get into, which is how we do it. These are NTEU's core values. Again, this is a leadership-driven class, so it's important that these 12 values sort of be a compass to you. I use them a lot when I ask myself in tough situations and as I, problem solve conflict or try to negotiate an alternative dispute resolution. Issues that we handle, sometimes they're black and white and they're really easy to sort of know how you feel about them. And sometimes they get kind of complicated. And so I use these core values to sort of guide me in figuring out what's best. And so I want to go over them because they're not something that often at the local level stewards get educated about. So let's dive right in. Next slide, please. So these are, we have 12, and I don't believe they're in any particular order. So let's just go right over them. They may be in alphabetical order now that I look at them. Active internal and external organizing. Just like the word steward, organizing is a term of art. It means to bring people into representation externally. And internal organizing is essentially building collective power within a chapter that we already have. That could be through membership building, but also could be through engagement, making sure different groups of members and non-members are engaged in a particular issue. There may be a mass grievance that people sign on to, or some sort of formal organizing around an issue. Obviously, in traditional context, organizing can also mean organizing a strike. However, as federal employees, you're barred from striking. So it's the non-strike versions of organizing. Best representation, like I said, this is where the sweet spot of NTEU's representation is. It's a core value, number 2 right here. In addition to our building our strength and our growth, we want to give the best representation we can in the federal sector. And that's where a lot of your training is geared towards. You're going to go through a grievance handling class, that will analyze some different case issues. And you'll really learn the fundamentals of representation at this week's training conference. Being good stewards of our union resources. This happens at the local level all the way to the national level. We're a 501c5, meaning that our revenue derives from representational issues, both membership and litigation attorney's fees. So we have to be cognizant of where we're spending money and why we're spending money. And these values do a good job in guiding that as well. None of that really falls to the stewards level, but just be aware that that's something that your elected officials have to consider when they're managing your chapter budgets. Next slide, please. Okay. Increasing participation. This gets into engagement, making sure people's voices are heard, different groups of employees in one area or one series or one POE may not be heard as much as other areas. And so trying to sort of increase people's engagement, understanding with the union. And candidly, so much of the union's strength at the local level is derived from what members share with them and what they say to them about their issues. And therefore, the chapter can get involved on their behalf. So the more people that trust and know and engage with the chapter and participate with the chapter, the stronger the chapter is at the local level. Transparent and ethical enterprise. We try to run our chapters in a transparent and ethical way. And importantly for CBP, we try to hold management to those same standards. A lot of my chapters work hard on transparency. They're not necessarily able to bargain or change the outcome of everything, but they want to push for transparency in the processes of those decisions being made. Another really important value at NTEU and something growing in importance across the nation is diversity and inclusion, making sure that our representation of employees we're acknowledging the diversity of the workforce, and we're creating an environment where all employees feel included in the local chapter and that they have a sense of belonging and representation in that or local organization. Next slide, please. Innovation and creativity, whether it's with our Office of General Counsel and the way that they try to create innovative and creative legal arguments to address novel legal issues, or it's local stewards coming up with innovative and creative settlements or alternative remediation solutions to employee situations. NTEU prides itself on doing things differently and advancing the ball. Taking measured risks, again, this is all throughout the representational process, to take a settlement or to not to take a settlement, what type of issues come up through the grievance at arbitration. There's always a balancing of risk. It's part of your decision-making process. And candidly, it's part of what makes a steward role a leadership role. And often many of our stewards are selected for leadership positions at management, in the managerial chain for demonstrated leadership. So it's definitely a skill. I don't think it's a trait. I think it's something that needs to be practiced, but it is something that's really important. And again, with robust debate, this comes down to whether you have a local LMRC, you're in some sort of step 2 meeting, but this is the fundamental purpose of the grievance procedure and a lot of the existence of the union is to create conversation. And often what that turns into is robust debate between management, those quote unquote who have power, and the collective bargaining unit, those who quote unquote only derive their power from the strength of their numbers, and creating healthy discussion about whatever the issue is, whether that's a staffing issue, a BRP issue, a scheduling issue, but sort of giving a new perspective on management and forcing some debate on what's in the best interest of employees. Next slide, please. And these are the last of the 12, also continually important. I don't think some are more important than others. Talented and engaged workforce. This is about people thinking positively about where they work, giving their discretionary energy to their work, and being talented and both engaged in their work, in alignment with CBP's mission. Integrity and consistency, conducting ourselves in a way that we maintain our integrity. We're going to talk specifically what that means. There's nothing worse in a training when someone throws out a word like integrity and then doesn't do any actual training on it. So we're going to do some actual training on what that means, but also holding management to those same standards as sort of an accountability check on management's power. And lastly, a learning organization that taps the knowledge of the entire union. So at the local level, what that looks like is polling your membership, talking to your bargaining unit about what they know about an issue. At the national level, which you'll see a video later that discusses this more, which is one of the main roles of our chapters and stewards, is to give national information. So we understand what's the national landscape of an issue, and we need to hear from our members and our stewards directly on those issues quite often to help our success. So next slide, please. We're going to move now into another poll. So pull up your poll slide. And now I want you guys to we're going to take 10 minutes now. So this will be a mini break. It's a great time to take a bathroom break or grab a snack if you need to. It is 9:35 Mountain. We're not going to take a formal break with a break slide, but we will return to conversation at 1:45. And in those 10 minutes, I want you to review this poll. These are the 12 core values of NTEU, and I want you only get one vote. So I want you to really think about which of these values resonates with you most. And I want you to vote on that, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the chat when we return in 10 minutes. But again, we don't need a break slide. We're just going to let people review the poll and take a few minutes to themselves. And so we'll leave up what you can actually see. the poll has 67 votes in it. Overwhelmingly, the response is integrity and consistency. It's really good to see some other values also highlighted: good stewards of our resources, diversity and inclusion, transparent and ethical. But what I wanted to say were a couple quick things. Number one, ideally more than one of these values resonates with you. It's not just one value, it's several values. So take some time to consider if you had listed 3 or 5 of them. I think in your participant guide, it says you should list 3. Maybe write them on the back of the paper with your why or the bottom, because these values should be guiding your values-based decisions as you enter challenging, complex issues where it's not a clear yes or a clear no, it's a complicated issue. Leaning on your values can help you navigate pretty challenging decision-making processes. So consider that. Then what I also had said was, since integrity and consistency is the overwhelming value here, I'm not surprised. As a seasoned CBP field rep, I am not surprised to see that as the strongest value in this group. And so what I had done is invited you all to come over to the chat if that was the one you had voted on yes in the poll. I wanted to know a little bit more about that. So the questions I had posed to those who said integrity and consistency was the most important to them, the questions I had posed in the chat were, what does integrity and consistency mean to you? You can answer that question in the chat, and or answer the question of, has the agency provided you any post-academy training to help you build the skill of integrity and consistency? And I say it's a skill because while I do think that people have predispositions towards it or not towards it, understanding what integrity is and how to act with integrity is a skill and a practice. And it's something that takes intention. So those are the questions in the chat. I'll let you guys answer those real quickly since we lost a little time with that technical glitch, and I'll copy them back. So again, if you voted for integrity and consistency, what does that mean to you? And has the agency provided you any tools in post-academy training to help you grow that skill in the workplace? And if you didn't respond that integrity and consistency is your number one value, that's okay. I still encourage you to head over to the chat for the conversation. And I'll give you guys 2 or 3 minutes to enter some responses in the chat. Yes. Eddie, your definition's spot on. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one's looking, is what Anthony had said, but what Eddie said is the textbook definition. It's when your words and your actions are in alignment. Yeah. Not surprised to hear, Robin, that you haven't been given much training on it. And it's also one of the problems we see with managers. Not all managers are bad. Some managers are really great. Some managers are former union members or union leaders, but the problem is they don't get a lot of leadership development. And so they're not really always that well supported. Keeping your word and remaining true. Thanks, Renee. We're going to talk a little bit more about what you do when you can't keep your word, but I think that that's right. Yeah, I love what Jose added. Integrity is taught at home. It's like not something you wear at work and don't wear in your regular life. It's a practice that should be sort of personal to you throughout your life, both at home, personal, and at work. Yeah, no training, not seeing much on that. I'll give 1 or 2 more minutes for you, those of you typing. I appreciate your engagement. Yeah, Eugene points out that integrity and consistency go hand in hand, meaning that if you're inconsistent with your words, your actions, or how you're treating people in alignment with those, you can't have integrity. And I would totally agree with that. Yes, it's a practice. Thanks for your contribution, Douglas. Yeah. All right. Well, this is a great discussion. I'll keep seeing if anything else we, yeah. Sorry, I'm just reading one of the chats. What Guy's saying about management having different levels of integrity. It's not a complete black and white, but we're going to talk about when integrity gets gray, that's a break in trust, and that's what ruins strong relationships. both with management and important that you're able to build relationships, as so many of you identified in the beginning, both ways as a bridge. And so if you break integrity with management, or management breaks its integrity with you and breaks your trust, you're not going to be able to be that two-way bridge or communicator as well. Same thing with employees. So it sort of helps the quality of your relationships. And we're going to talk about some specific strategies to prevent integrity issues from impacting your relationships in a negative way. Thanks so much for the conversation in the chat. You can keep it going amongst yourselves. We're going to move on to the next segment, which is called Everyday Leadership. So we'll move on to the next slide, Samira. So let's talk about what leadership is. You'll see a running theme in this course, right? First, we ground down into a concept with a definition, and we sort of build some consensus around our understanding of it. And then we talk about how it applies to your role as a steward. So we're going to do the same here for leadership. There are so many definitions of leadership beyond the Merriam-Webster definition. But I wanted to start there, right? Because leadership, as Simon Sinek points out at the very end of that clip, is not a position, it's an action. It's something you can do regardless of what your position is. So although you are encumbering a position of recognized leadership as a steward, just because you're a steward in title doesn't mean you're a leader. It's the manner in which you act as a steward that qualifies and you to be a leader, and sort of goes to the strength of your leadership. So while the action of leadership is the formal definition, what I want to sort of ground you into the orientation of is that your capacity for leadership at the local level is your ability to positively influence others towards NTEU's goal achievement. And I want to talk to you a little bit about some parts of that definition. First of all, it's about positively influencing people, not negatively influencing people, not threatening people, not coercing people. I know this is very apparent, but it's worth focusing on that. It's about your positive influence on others. That is the measure of your leadership. And then towards NTEU's goals achievement, that could be a number of things. That could be participating in our legislative action centers, drive to contact our legislators on a certain bill. That could be at the local level to get a number of people to sign on to a mass grievance. That could be at the national level, to attend an event, or to understand or go through a claims process for a reimbursement under a settlement agreement, or an award under arbitration award. So there's lots of different goals that NTEU has at the national level, at the local level, or at the individual level, getting what's in the employee's best interest, even though maybe their judgment could be a little bit clouded in what's their best interest, because they're very invested in the personal facts of their case. So it's all sorts of different goals, but it's about how do you build relationships and communicate in a way that others want to join those goals. And that's what we're going to dive into. It's really important to know that you'll perform so many different roles as a steward, but leadership is not something you will do as a steward. It is a way of being. And it's about servant leadership, about serving those who you're leading, your bargaining unit. And to the extent that you're influencing them in a positive direction, that is how to measure the strength of your leadership. Next slide, please. I love this quote. "There go my people. I must run to catch up with them, for I am their leader." This is from Gandhi. This is about the philosophy of being a steward on the front line. This is something where, it's not a hierarchy where you're on top of. You're equal to the frontline workforce, or however you want to say it. And it's important that you understand that sometimes your leadership will be leading from behind, meaning that your bargaining unit is raising an issue, your members are raising an issue, and then you have to sort of investigate that issue, understand that issue, and sort of figure out how to position that issue with management. But we're going to now do another TED Talk. I'll be curious to know in the chat, have you guys ever heard of Everyday Leadership? This TED Talk's a bit shorter. It's about 7 minutes, but man, is it impactful. So I'll have you pop in the chat for a second while Samira stops sharing. Have you heard of the TED Talk Everyday Leadership by Drew Dudley? Thanks, Samira. My guess is no. It's a lot less popular than the Simon Sinek talk. But again, I'll just say that I hope you come back to some of these videos and some of these resources as they're really powerful. So let's dive into this video. It's about, I believe, about six minutes.
Let's start by asking everyone in the audience here a question. How many of you are completely comfortable with calling yourselves a leader? See, I've asked that question all the way across the country, and everywhere I ask it, no matter where, there's always a huge portion of the audience that won't put up their hand. And I've come to realize that we have made leadership into something bigger than us. We made it into something beyond us. We made it about changing the world. And we've taken this title of leader and we treat it as if it's something that one day we're going to deserve. But to give it to ourselves right now means a level of arrogance or cockiness that we're not comfortable with. And I worry sometimes that we spend so much time celebrating amazing things that hardly anybody can do, that we've convinced ourselves that those are the only things we're celebrating. And we start to devalue the things that we can do every day. And we start to take moments where we truly are a leader, and we don't let ourselves take credit for it, and we don't let ourselves feel good about it. And I've been lucky enough over the last 10 years to work with some amazing people who have helped me redefine leadership in a way that I think has made me happier. And with my short time today, I just want to share with you the one story most responsible for that redefinition. I went to a school on a little school called Mount Allison University in Sackville, New Brunswick. And on my last day there, a girl came up to me and she said, "I remember the first time that I met you." And then she told me a story that happened 4 years earlier. She said, "On my day before I started university, I was in the hotel room with my mom and my dad, and I was so scared and so convinced that I couldn't do this, that I wasn't ready for university, that I just burst into tears. And my mom and my dad were amazing. They were like, 'Look, we know you're scared, but let's just go tomorrow. Let's go to the first day. And if at any point you feel as if you can't do this, that's fine. Just tell us, we will take you home. We love you no matter what.'" And she says, so I went the next day and I was standing in line getting ready for registration, and I looked around and I just knew I couldn't do it. I knew I wasn't ready. I knew I had to quit. And she says, I made that decision, and as soon as I made it, there was this incredible feeling of peace that came over me. And I turned to my mom and my dad to tell them that we needed to go home. And just at that moment, you came out of the Student Union building wearing the stupidest hat I have ever seen in my life. It was awesome. And you had a big sign promoting Shinorama, which is Students Fighting Cystic Fibrosis, a charity I've worked with for years. And you had a bucket full of lollipops. And you were walking along and you were handing the lollipops out to people in line and talking about Shinorama. And all of a sudden, you got to me and you just stopped and you stared. It was creepy. This girl right here knows exactly what I'm talking about. And then you looked at the guy next to me and you smiled and you reached in your bucket, you pulled out a lollipop and you held it out to him. And you said, "You need to give a lollipop to the beautiful woman standing next to you." And she said, "I have never seen anyone get more embarrassed faster in my life." He turned beet red and he wouldn't even look at me. He just kind of held the lollipop out like this. And I felt so bad for this dude that I took the lollipop. And as soon as I did, you got this incredibly severe look on your face and you looked at my mom and my dad and you said, "Look at that. Look at that. First day away from home, and already she's taking candy from a stranger." And she said everybody lost it. 20 feet in every direction, everyone started to howl. And I know this is cheesy, and I don't know why I'm telling you this, but in that moment when everyone was laughing, I knew that I shouldn't quit. I knew that I was where I was supposed to be, and I knew that I was home. And I haven't spoken to you once in the 4 years since that day, but I heard that you were leaving. And I had to come up and tell you that you've been an incredibly important person in my life, and I'm gonna miss you. Good luck. And she walks away, and I'm flattened. And she gets about 6 feet away, she turns around and smiles and goes, "You should probably know this too. I'm still dating that guy 4 years later." A year and a half after I moved to Toronto, I got an invitation to their wedding. Here's the kicker, I don't remember that. I have no recollection of that moment, and I've searched my memory banks because that is funny, and I should remember doing it, and I don't remember it. And that was such an eye-opening, transformative moment for me to think that maybe the biggest impact I'd ever had on anyone's life, a moment that had a woman walk up to a stranger 4 years later and say, "You've been an incredibly important person in my life," was a moment that I didn't even remember. How many of you guys have a lollipop moment, a moment where someone said something or did something that you feel fundamentally made your life better? All right. How many of you have told that person they did it? See, why not? We celebrate birthdays where all you have to do is not die for 365 days. And yet we let people who have made our lives better walk around without knowing it. And every single one of you has been the catalyst for a lollipop moment. You have made someone's life better by something that you said or that you did. And if you think you haven't, think about all the hands that didn't go back up when I asked that question. You're just one of the people who hasn't been told. But it is so scary to think of ourselves as that powerful. It can be frightening to think that we can matter that much to other people. Because as long as we make leadership something bigger than us, as long as we keep leadership something beyond us, as long as we make it about changing the world, we give ourselves an excuse not to expect it every day from ourselves and from each other. Marianne Williamson said, our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our greatest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light and not our darkness that frightens us. And my call to action today is that we need to get over that. We need to get over our fear of how extraordinarily powerful we can be in each other's lives. We need to get over it so we can move beyond it. And our little brothers and our little sisters, and one day our kids, or our kids right now, can watch us start to value the impact we can have on each other's lives more than money and power and titles and influence. We need to redefine leadership as being about lollipop moments. How many of them we create, how many of them we acknowledge, how many of them we pay forward, and how many of them we say thank you for. Because we've made leadership about changing the world, and there is no world. There's only 6 billion understandings of it. And if you change one person's understanding of it, one person's understanding of what they're capable of, one person's understanding of how much people care about them, one person's understanding of how powerful an agent for change they can be in this world, you've changed the whole thing. And if we can understand leadership like that, I think if we can redefine leadership like that, I think we can change everything. And it's a simple idea, but I don't think it's a small one. And I want to thank you all so much for letting me share it with you today.
All right, I'll do a quick sound check this time before I start speaking too much. Samir, can you hear me? Okay, great. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that video. I think it's one of the shortest TED Talks that I've seen with the most power. I'll ask you to head over now to the poll. At the beginning of the talk, Drew says, how many people are comfortable calling themselves a leader? And he takes a poll of the group. So I'd like to take that same poll. Answer honestly. Your polling is anonymous. How many of you consider yourself a leader and are comfortable saying that? And I'll give 2 minutes for the poll. 55 votes, 1 more minute for the poll. Really high participation. Thanks all for that. So I'm really happy to hear that 87% of you said that you do feel yourself comfortable calling a leader. Like I said, I'm not surprised. Your training is so thorough in the roles that you do to support CBP's mission. Obviously, primarily, I would assume we have mostly officers here. But I will say, to the extent you answered no, number one, I appreciate your honesty and your vulnerability. I think that's really important. But I also hope that after this class, that is boosted a little bit to a maybe or a yes. So I'm going to add another poll in real quick. All right, the next poll is up. So Drew also talks about lollipop moments. He talks about this idea where he shares this story, right, of when he handed a lollipop to this woman and it essentially changed her life, and that she took the time to go back and tell him that this moment was really pivotal in her life. And so my question in the poll is, have you ever shared a lollipop moment with the person who created it? Have you gone back and been the woman of the story and said, hey, you know, what you did for me changed my day, it changed my week, it helped my family? You know, and then there will be one more poll we're going to do after that. So weigh in on this poll now. Have you ever shared your lollipop moment? For have you ever shared a lollipop moment? We have 73 votes in. 67% of you have shared that. That is awesome. I really think that's amazing. But notice how 31% of you have not shared that compared to the 13% comfortable calling your leader. This is the trend that Drew's talking about, right? That sometimes we're not that comfortable calling ourselves a leader, but we've never shared those moments. And now I've asked one final poll. Has anyone shared a lollipop moment with you that you created as their NTEU steward? Give that poll 1 more minute. And if you have said yes to this last question, I'm going to ask you to head over to the chat to have some conversation. Tell us what that lollipop moment was. Share us some context with that, especially for those of us that are new stewards. It's not surprising to me that 70% of you are saying no when a large percentage of you, I believe 50% or 52% of you have only been a steward for less than a year. So that's not super surprising. But for those of you who are saying yes in this final poll, head over to the chat and share with us a little context about that lollipop moment, and I'll discuss them as a conversation. While we're giving you guys some time to write responses, I'll tell you guys of a lollipop moment I had at NTEU several years ago, but it's something that really sticks with me and also is one of those things that I reach onto when this job gets extra challenging. In a prior role at NTEU, I was in the negotiations department and I was negotiating a MOU for a national unit. It was actually for IRS. And it was pursuant to an executive order that had come out about allowing nursing mothers to breastfeed and pump, not to breastfeed, but breastfeeding mothers to pump at work. And it was my role as a national negotiator to put together an MOU, much like you guys have seen before, for any sorts of issues. And I put together this MOU, and as I was doing it, I had a bargaining team and I had employees that were saying what was going on because the agency had not allowed the time or the space or the privacy, candidly, the dignity or respect for breastfeeding mothers. And in the context of that MOU, we secured private space and time for employees who are breastfeeding, women who are breastfeeding, new moms, to be able to pump at work in a space that provided them dignity. And one of the stories that was shared by the bargaining unit member was that this new mom had returned to work and she was forced to pump in her car during lunch. And that sounds like sort of not great. But what I really landed me is that the facility she worked in, it was a very public parking lot shared by UPS and a couple other providers. And so she was in her car basically exposed breastfeeding because the agency wouldn't give her a place to do it privately. And yeah, I'm happy to turn on my screen. Hey guys. So we're going to get back to the PowerPoint in a second, but I'm happy to turn on my screen for a little while. So what was really amazing about that is she really put a lot of context to the work that we were doing. It wasn't just language on a paper. It wasn't just rules about time and attendance. It was about giving nursing mothers dignity at work and providing a safe space for them to do a primary care function for their family. And that story made me feel like I wasn't just writing words on a paper and putting together an agreement. It really made me feel like I was changing everyday experiencing for new moms. And that was before I had a kid. And then a few years later, I had a kid and I had a whole new understanding for the demands on new moms. And so that to me is a lollipop moment I keep near and dear. I'm going to look at the chat now. I am going to turn off my video because my screen's over here and you're just going to keep seeing the side of my face. But Samira, can you pull up the slide? I'll stop sharing and you can pull up the slide that we're on. And I'm going to go over some of the lollipop moments. Can we define a lollipop moment? It's a moment that you thought was small, but made a really big difference to somebody else, or a moment where you didn't think it made a difference, but turns out it was a big moment to somebody else. Joe, thanks for your share. He talks about an IA witness interview. Essentially, he supported someone going through an IA interview for 3 hours while they were waiting outside. So IA interviews are a great area where the confidence, the support, and the trust that comes from just having a representative present. You're going to go through investigatory interviews as a class in this training. I believe it's part of this tracks training this week in another class about the rules of that. But that is a great place where having a representative makes a big difference emotionally, psychologically, and mentally for a lot of our employees. Oh, this is amazing. Lisa is talking about how she worked on an issue to get a certain, holiday leave schedule, essentially, to allow people to get excusals for Christmas. And he said it was this employee had come up to her and said that it was his first Christmas off with his family for the first time since they had worked with CBP. Again, seems like a small thing, but makes a big difference. I'm getting some feedback that people can't hear me in the chat. Samira, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Okay. All right. I'm going to just keep going then. Yeah, exactly. Renee's also talking about a small lollipop moment. It's so much a role of stewards to just provide some emotional support to employees. Samira, I'll have you share the slide. We're on slide 28, so people don't have to blink face. We'll pull that up for you guys in a second. But I think that's right. You know, so much of what employees sometimes want. I used to teach this class before it was revamped, and we talked about the roles of the steward. And I always used to say, thanks, Alex, for the feedback about hearing. Sounds like it's mostly not me. So I'm going to just keep going. Samira, can you hear me? Oh, there it goes. Okay, great. So we're on slide 28. So 2 more. Perfect. So, you know, that's a big part of being a steward, is essentially this role of like therapist or psychologist, where people just need to vent a lot of what's going on for our bargaining unit. Sometimes it's stress at work. Sometimes it's mental health issues, PTSD issues, family issues. That provides a lot of relief for our employees to be able to have a place to go in the union office to talk about those issues. That being said, that role is extremely draining and tiring for our representatives when we provide this emotional, psychological support for employees. So what I will say is that we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but let's dive into the next segment of this class. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about positive impact. We've shared some stories of positive impact. Now we're going to get into another tool. It's pretty simple, but it's called the impact equation. And this is something where we talked about what you get in, what you put in is what you get out. And I would write this out. It helps to commit it to memory. Perception plus performance equals impact. This idea is that you need to be constantly aware of the perception you have as a steward in the workplace and how you're performing as a steward if you want to amplify your impact and all of those amazing whys we heard at the beginning about being a bridge and protecting people. If you want to live that out, this is a great tool to do it. Next slide, please. And you can also follow along in your participant guide. I'm not going to call out certain sections, but all of this stuff is really covered in quite detail if you're able to pull that up or have it printed in front of you. So let's talk a little bit about perception, what we mean by that, and what are the tools to go over with that. Perception is really your reputation. I mean, it's the simplest way to say it, but what people think about you in the bargaining unit. And we're going to go over a few key tools to good perception management as a steward. Number one, hold yourself out as a steward. I don't think you guys are going to have that issue too much in your workplace, but especially if you are coming from a non-OFO environment or you're representing employees where you don't physically see them, this is a challenge at some of our other agencies we represent where people don't even know who is a steward. So wearing your steward's pin, if your chapter has those, telling people you're a steward, if you're assigned a permanent desk or a cube, putting something up to say that, making sure your contact information is readily available, especially in this quasi-hybrid world we're living in. So support, number three, support national and local NTEU. This goes into perception of the union, the local chapter. So if there's a decision being made, if there is a decision not to take a grievance, there's a decision to take a settlement, NTEU National didn't pursue some type of case in court, it's really, really important that if you don't understand the context of that or the why that is, that you find that out before you answer questions about it. So we're going to go over this. But if someone says, why did NTEU not open the contract? Or why does NTEU not improve the telework language to let administrative unit officers telework or whatever it is. If you don't know, it's really critical to maintain your solid perception and the perception of your chapter to ask the questions. Say, I don't know, I'll get more information on that. But generally, you are appointed at the pleasure of your chapter president and derivatively at National NTEU. So you should be trying to understand and give NTEU both locally and nationally benefit of the doubt. Now, if you disagree with a decision, we'll talk about how to communicate that. But generally, it's important that you sort of get the information you need to rebuff any concerns. Often what we see is people misunderstanding. And once that they're given context, oh, we didn't open the contract because we would lose X if we did. Oh, well, then the decision to not open the contract seems more reasonable. So all decisions have a lot of context about them. But this is our small way of saying, don't forget to ask. Parts of a message we're going to go over, but psychology says pretty clearly that how people hear communication, what you say matters less than how you say it. So consider the tone, the body language, and how you're delivering sensitive news. If you're using email or you're meeting somebody in person or picking up the phone, all of these things really matter to the perception of a message. And we're going to talk about what's called the Batari cycle or the Batari box. Be accountable for your personal attitude and behavior and how it affects other people, especially in contentious situations, in an investigatory interview, a grievance meeting, an LMRC, and the like. Next slide, please. I'll say that perception comes first in the impact equation for a specific reason, because as soon as you have a negative perception, whether that's in your unit, your branch, your group, your work unit, whatever, your impact as a steward is immediately diminished, because often people won't trust you to come to you with their issues because they don't believe either you're going to respond to them or they don't believe that you're open-minded enough to hear them or whatever other things impact perception. So I'm going to do a quick tone exercise. So I want everybody to close your eyes. I won't know if you're actually doing it because I can't see you. And I'm going to say 3 versions of the same sentence. And I want you to think about how each version made you feel. And I'll have you pop it into the chat. The first one is, why can't you do what I asked? I'll repeat that. Why can't you do what I asked? Think about how that makes you feel. And enter some words in the chat. For the second one, why can't you do what I asked? Why can't you do what I asked? And the last one, why can't you do what I asked? Why can't you do what I asked? Yes, yes. I love Joy Hannah's response. That's right. Yep. First one sounds impatient, aggressive. I've emphasized the you, right? I'm blaming you. That's right. Second one, annoyed. Yep, tired, annoyed. Those of you who have kids, it's probably what I would say to my 3-year-old. Why can't you do what I asked? That's number 2. Tired, defeated. Yeah. Thanks for your feedback, Noelle. And the last one, why can't you do what I asked? Yeah. Right? So this is a really simple exercise. I think you guys are mostly getting it. This is just to show you that everything you're saying, whether you're saying aggressive or annoyed or polite or however you're characterizing it in the chat, thanks for the feedback for those of you who are participating. It doesn't actually 100% matter. You know, we're over virtual. You can't see my body language. You're not looking at my face. But I will say that see how the main point is this. The content was the same. Next slide, please. So even though the content was the same, you got, this sounds like me when I talk to my kids. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's important to recognize that we know that there are 3 parts of a message. Samira, for some reason your share was working and now I don't see it. It's coming back through. Okay, great. Yeah, go back 1 slide to the parts of a message. Perfect, thank you. So we know, and this is a pretty old study, so you may be familiar with it, but it's a seminal study from 1971. And what we know is that word choice is 7% of how somebody receives a message. That's the what you say. 55% green is body language. Of course, in somewhat of a remote world with masks on, we get a lot less body language feedback. You don't see if someone's smiling or scowling, hard to see the rest of their face. So tone is becoming even more important in this virtual society. And we have 38% being tone. So this really gets into how conflicts escalate when you're presenting a grievance, how debates, robust debates at LMRCs sometimes get quite heated, because a lot of times what people are responding are to the tone and not the word choice. Next slide. The greatest leaders build their self-awareness continually, meaning that you are developing yourself as a leader throughout your leadership. And that's where we're going to go into the next segment. So this gets into the last tip of perception, which is managing your attitudes and your behaviors. So we're going to talk about what the Batari box is real quick, and then we're going to talk about some tips to break it. So this won't be maybe something you've never heard what it's called, but I think you're pretty much all going to be pretty familiar with what it is. So we talked about how leadership is the ability to positively influence others towards goal achievement, not negatively influence them. So to that extent, it's important that you understand the core of a relationship between leaders and those whom they lead, and candidly between any 2 humans. So you can do this with a spouse or a partner, a sibling, a child. It doesn't really matter. Any 2 humans interacting have a risk of a Batari box cycle. So how you are perceived by those whom you desire to lead, i.e. the bargaining unit, it's critically important because it goes to their perception of you, i.e. that you're not going to be a strong leader if people don't have a positive perception of you. So what does this mean? It means that we need to consider how our attitudes and our behaviors are affecting others. It's this idea that we look at both our communication tendencies and our emotional drivers when we're communicating. So essentially what we want to look at with the Batari box, and this is really in detail in that participant guide. So I'll refer you back to the files section of the platform and the email that you got with the Batari cycle. But essentially, we're going to talk about reaction versus response. So the idea of a reaction is that it's emotional, and a response is something where you can take a pause or only be able to realize that your tone may be triggering somebody else's tone or attitude or behavior. Response is when you have a responsibility. So you've all heard the word responsibility, right? Like that to me means obligation, duties, parents have responsibilities, adults have responsibilities. It's like this negative thing sometimes. But what we really want to focus on is that in a leadership sense, you have a responsibility, meaning that you are measured in your ability to respond rather than to react. And in the law enforcement environment, this won't be super challenging for many of you because you've been trained to sort of intervene, to break certain cycles, to understand how to intervene in hostile situations. But I do think it's important to consider how this happens in the representational environment. So I'm going to give you an example of a loop in the next slide. Samira, oh, great. Thank you. So attitudes, right? This could be how we act based on our behavioral displays. This could be impacted by a lot of different things. If you're having a crappy day, if you've had a tough commute, if your child gave you a hard time when you're right out the door, if your manager says something to you condescending when you start your shift, right? We know that what ends up happening is that your behavior affects others' attitudes. You go into a room with a negative attitude, that's going to affect how people respond to you. What ends up happening is we get stuck in these loops where your attitude's affecting your behavior is affecting the attitudes of others, which affects their behavior, which continues to affect your attitude. The easiest example of this is if you have a child or you know a young child, or if you've ever been in a fight with your spouse or your partner, right? If one of you comes into a bad mood and comes home from work in a bad mood, rightfully so, you had a tough day or things were difficult, your spouse or your partner asks you a question and you bite their head off. What is the reaction of your partner? Usually to respond to you biting their head off in a negative way, which usually feeds your irritation. And I can say this happens to me in my relationship. It happens to me with my kid. When I tell my child to do something and I say, hey, I really need you to stop doing this. If she gives me attitude or doesn't stop doing that, that increases my anger or my frustration. And then she's responding to my frustration rather than to my request. And so it's a pretty basic concept, but looking at the Batari box, next slide, please, is something that we are asking you as leaders to consider how it goes into your perception. Often what happens at the local level is that you are going to be working with the same chiefs, the same APDs, the same first line soups, whoever it is, and your overall relationship with them and how they build their trust in you and vice versa is going to impact your outcomes. So it's really important when you're having something going on to sort of recognize that, build that self-awareness, stop yourself in the moment. So sometimes what I'm able to do, and I'm not always able to do it, is I realize that my tone is escalated. I realize that I'm getting angry because I'm frustrated about something else, and what my daughter is or is not doing is frustrating me more. I can stop, intervene myself, break that cycle. Next slide, please, Samira. And from there, what I can do is get a better outcome because she's not going to be responding to my nasty tone or my difficult body language. So here are some tips. This is one of the slides I would print out or write down for things that actually can help you when you're back into the work of representation. Often it's a simple mantra. It's like people's behaviors are about them and not about you. So if I'm having a difficult time with a representational issue, I remind myself that, and I'm literally like, this is not about me. This is about them. That helps me depersonalize what's going on. This sounds really simple. This is like advice my mom gave me a long time ago, right? Don't write an email when you're angry. That's like really simple to say. What it's really hard to do is not actually do that and respond, not react. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll write an email to management that's pretty emotionally charging because they've pissed me off. And so what I'll do is I'll write the email with nobody in the to line. And then I sort of let it sit for a while before I put it in writing. And often what I do is I edit it and I tone it down a little bit because I got some of the emotion out, and then I can have them focus more on what I'm actually saying. Don't take it home with you. This is really hard, especially in the 24-hour environments that so many of you work with, but do your best to set boundaries, to try to leave what's going on at work, especially with regards to NTEU, at work and not take it home. It's that type of consistent drain that we see burn people out, both in their jobs at the agency, leads to poor mental health outcomes, and more serious side effects like suicidal thoughts and incidents of domestic violence. But also what it also does is it causes people to burn out. They don't want to be stewards anymore. They don't want to be chapter leaders anymore. So it's really important that this work at some level is supposed to be enjoyable. And maybe enjoyable is like not the best word, but fulfilling, meaning that you should be anchoring down to those values and that why. And if you're not sort of getting that out of this work, maybe not every day or every week, but in the long run, you should be having a conversation with your chapter leaders, your chief steward about, what part of the steward's roles are not working for you and how you can sort of adjust so that we maintain your engagement and you stay a steward rather than burning out and wanting to quit. We're going to talk also about some deep breathing techniques. There's a ton of science coming out in the last 5 to 10 years about the power of the breath to calm the amygdala and the emotional center of the brain. And so we'll go over that later, but that's another thing you can do is take some some deep breaths before you proceed to respond or react. Sometimes when I'm with my chapters and things get heated, I take a caucus. I literally take them for a timeout. And I'm like, we all need a timeout. We need to de-escalate this situation. So that's something that I rely on a lot. So that's the first part of the impact equation, perception. And now we're going to move into performance. Next slide, please. So this is like a simple fill in the blank. Performance is the process of carrying out or accomplishing an action, a task, or function. It's what you do, how well you do it, and here's the key: how well you communicate what you're doing. Not just how well you do it, but if no one knows how well you're doing your job as a representative and how you're making a difference for the members, then it has a lot less impact on the bargaining unit and the perceptions of our union. We're going to talk about all the different roles that stewards serve in performance, but this is the second part of the equation, and candidly where we're going to spend the most time, because it's the performance of stewardship roles that has brought many of you to training. So next slide, please. Great. So for this part, I'm going to pull up, Samira, don't stop sharing yet, but I'm going to pull up the participant guide, because this is really well explained in the participant guide. And I think seeing those notes will be really helpful. So I'm going to share them. Just give me one moment, everybody, to pull that up. Let's see. All right, Samira, I'm going to have you stop sharing for a second. Okay, let's see if I can pull this up so you guys can see it with me. Okay. Let's see if this is, whoa, stand by, just working on my Zoom. Samira, is that readable at all?
I am having a little trouble reading it, but maybe people can respond in the chat. It might be bigger on the participant screen. Is that right?
I want it to be helpful. So if it's not helpful, then it won't be working. Yeah, if anybody can respond in the chat if you can see this. Otherwise, let's see if people are responding in the chat. Okay, great. So give me 1 second. We're going to be on page, I just want to get the right page number within the guide. Yeah, we're going to be on page 7, it looks like. Yeah, 7. Okay. So this is where we talk a lot about what makes a great steward. You know, what really matters. And you'll see that under 1A, it's quality products, right? So the first thing we were going to talk about is substance. Know what you know and know what you don't. This really gets to the contract. Okay, yeah, it seems like some of you can't see it. But again, you have this document in the Files tab. So if you can't see it on this screen or you're not able to enlarge it on your screen, make sure you pull it up. We're going to go over it, and it's nothing that you can't look at later, but yes, exactly. Thanks, Eric. I appreciate that. It was also emailed to you a few days ago, but we're on page 7 of it. And what it talks about is, and you can just listen to me, you don't have to read along, but essentially is first you need to know what you know and what you don't. One of the major mistakes we see with new stewards is this human desire to want to give an answer to a question immediately, especially in the work environment, especially if somebody comes up to you like, in between a flight landing or when things are slow and they come down to you and they say, hey, this happened to me. I wasn't called for overtime yesterday. And they start like spilling out all their facts and they want to talk to you because you're the steward on shift or in the area. And new stewards don't know everything. Candidly, I've been a CBP field rep for almost 8 years and I do not know this contract by heart. It's 230 pages. I know a lot of the provisions by heart and I know some of them incredibly well. But it's really important that as a new steward, you get comfortable with these 3 words. I don't know. I don't know. And this really gets into integrity as well. It's stewards who say what they think to be true. Oh, I'm sure that's grievable. And then they go back, they find out it's not grievable. What that looks like is you're not meeting your word. I think Renee had written that in some of the feedback, right? Integrity is keeping your word. So you don't want to make a promise or give a word you can't. So you have to get comfortable with saying, oh, I'm still figuring things out. Let me look into it. I don't know. And then here's the key part of integrity. Create a feedback loop. Let me look into it. I need a few days. I'm not on official time. I'll get back to you X date, or I'll be back in touch with you by this time, or follow up with me if you haven't heard from me by this time. And what that says is it sets expectations. You're not going to have an immediate answer. And candidly, employees don't want that. They want the right answer. They don't want the immediate answer. And then you can ask questions of your chapter president, your chief steward. If they don't know, they'll reach out to national staff. Nobody knows it all. We're in the era of knowledge brokering, meaning that collectively, generally in this group and as part of the labor movement, this group of 90 people together has much more collective knowledge than just Samira and I by ourselves, even though we're the national reps. So it's really important to remember that you're going to have to reach out to a network of people to sometimes get the answers you need. So that's substance, right? Getting to know the contract. We'll go over some other tips of that. Form. This is very simple, but try to do spelling and grammar checks the best you can. Obviously, no one's perfect. Obviously, people make typos and grammar is not like everybody's best subject, but you're representing the union, especially when you're filing something. So having it as clean as you can is a good idea. Having someone check your work, having a chief steward read over something you're doing in the beginning, that's fundamental to strong stewardship. The second segment we're going to talk about in 1B is work style awareness. This is about thinking about, as a steward, how you work the best. So when you're tasked with researching something, drafting a 7114 information request, interviewing employees, and I'm not talking about representational work like an interview, but when you're doing work where you're researching, writing, and doing the representational work, how do you work best? Spend some time thinking about the place that you work best. For so many of you, the role of steward will be so different than the work you do for the agency. If you work primary or you're constantly on the line, in the lanes on the southern border, going to sit at a computer to write a grievance or to put together an oral reply is a totally different type of work. It's a totally different skill set. So you have the advantage to think about how you work best. Do you work best with music? Or if you work in the union office, are you going to be constantly interrupted? I have a lot of chapters that have that issue. Their union office is in such a place of visibility, they can never get anything done because people are constantly coming in and knocking. When's the most productive part of your day? Are you a person who rises and shines and you want to request your official time in the morning so you can work from 0500 to 0800 on the oral reply and then go in for your shift? Or are you a person that's not a big morning person and you want to request official time at the end of your shift? Do you like working in teams? Do you work independently? Excuse me. Do you work independently by yourself? If you like working in teams, can you ask for representation work where you can work with other stewards? And then the last and most important thing I'll recommend is number 5, B5 at the end of page 7. Do you understand what the goals of your work are? That can come from a grievance or an employee, but it also comes from your chapter. So it's important as a leader that you are responsible for getting clear and complete. And this is a phrase that I hope sticks with you from this training. It's this idea that you can close communication gaps. You understand, you don't have any, if you are clear and complete, what that means is that you don't have any follow-up questions, you are clear what's being asked of you, the expectations of you are clear, the deadlines for you are clear, and you're complete, meaning that you don't have anything more to add to the conversation, you don't have anything else you want to raise in discussion based on what the issue is or how it's been handled, that you've had the opportunity to sort of speak what needs to be spoken, and you understand your next steps. And if you feel clear and complete, and so does the employee that you're representing, or so does your leadership at the local level, you're in a good space to make sure you're meeting expectations. The last thing, which again sounds extremely like basic and it's simple, but it's so powerful, is meeting deadlines. How long will this task take you? Don't be afraid to ask for more time or follow up with more official time, especially early on. Things are going to take you longer for the first time you do them, but that's how you build the skill of confidence. The first grievance you write, you're not going to feel confident. The second, the third, maybe not. The fourth oral reply, you might feel really confident. So give yourself enough time and plan ahead. The number one thing in the contract I would recommend you know is deadlines. When someone comes to you, understand when their filing is due, leave yourself a few days for unexpected developments, work back with your schedule, and this will be a great way to sort of prevent some stress. So I'm going to now let you guys see the end of this section before we turn to the next section. And I'm going to ask Samir to pick up the slide sharing.
And what slide number are we on?
Yes, great question. I was just looking at that. We're on slide number, I'd like to, actually, you know what? Let's just do, I'm not going to do slide sharing. I'm sorry about that. We would be on 39, Samira, but I'm going to do some video. All right, guys, give me a second. All right. So now we're going to talk about inhibitors of positive performance. So we've gone over quality performance indicators, know what you know what you don't, forms, spelling, checking, time management, reasonably requesting extensions. We've also gone over work style awareness, how you work well, when you work well, what type of work you find fulfilling, managing your own engagement as a steward and the type of work you want to work on to the extent that your chapter can afford that luxury and give you certain types of assignments. But the main part of this segment isn't just giving you the basics of good performance. It's really going over how stress can be quite an inhibitor to positive performance. In this job, both your roles at CBP generally, but also your additional volunteer role of this idea of representation, standing up for the little guy, building the bridges. This can be an immense amount of stress on our representatives. And it's something that we want to take the time to discuss and have some robust discussion about and candid discussion about. But also something that as I've been doing this job longer and longer, I see how this can impact stewards and our chapter leaders, because the weight that you guys carry for your members can be quite heavy. So there's a lot of language to be read in the participant guide. I'm not going to read it to you verbatim, but some simple basics that I want us to understand is that in this role, often what representatives do is they take on the stress of the people that they're representing. It's pretty hard to compartmentalize an issue when someone's was being removed from their job for no reason, or is out tons of money because the agency screwed them, or is being discriminated against, or being bullied at work, or has mental health issues that are arising, or family stresses, and all of these things are converging. So just some general stress training we're going to go over now. So stress, obviously, it's a condition that a person feels, but it's a condition that we feel when two things are true. When we feel like demands exceed our personal and our social resources to handle the experience. So that's when it's important to recognize that what I'm training you on, you can also train your members on and people you're working with, right? So often employees come to us when they don't feel like they have the resources to handle the circumstances that are in front of them. They're coming to us in a pretty much often a state of stress. It's typically negative. I say that because stress can be positive. People can feel stressed to get to deadlines. Procrastinators often say like, well, it's the stress of the deadline that helps me get it done. But what we're talking about is negative stress, and especially for grievance, as they're emotionally invested in what's going on, it can really inhibit their ability to cope with it. So in addition to counseling employees and taking advantage of yourself of things like EAP at CBP, it's just really important to bring your awareness that stress isn't, there's no science to show that stress can be compartmentalized, i.e. the stress that you have from your tough family situation shows up in your LMRC meeting. The situation you have with a grievant comes home with you at night. And that's why I don't mean it to be superficial to say you should leave this at work. I think that's an incredibly hard thing to do, to set those boundaries and not take these things home with you. But it's really important for your long-term sustainability, doing this tough, important work for employees, that you have a plan and some awareness about how you're going to manage that amount of stress. Essentially, what we want to talk about is the emotional resilience that you will need to continually handle a stream of stressful situations. Is one of the things I think is the most challenging part of this role, is you handle a grievance and then a few weeks later, you handle another grievance. And then the next day there's a problem at work. And so there's this feeling of like constant fire putting out for a lot of our leaders and our national staff. And it's something that can be quite exhausting, because your job is to help stop the fire. So people are coming to you with those problems, and it's pretty hard to get a break sometimes in those. And it's that amount of consistent stress that can lead to burnout and fatigue. And so a lot of this part of the course is based in a lot of the science done for combat fatigue, and how many days of continual stress, body and mind, and a human can sort of sustain before we see a large decrease in their performance or burnout. And the answer is about 45 days. So 45 days of consistent stress is where the science shows people hit what's called combat fatigue. You know, if you, many of you have prior military background, may be familiar with this. So when an employee has an issue that's causing them lots of stress, the timeline in your contract is 45 days. So they're already, often by the time they come to us, this issue has been weighing over their head. That is the easiest example. Imagine an employee who's been under investigation for a year and has no assurance when that investigation will close. That's something else that causes burnout. So this part of the class, I'm going to talk about a few things. First, what I want to say is that this is to bring your awareness. Often, like I said, I could say, go do this later. You're not going to do it. But we want you to have a solid grounding, especially those of you in your first year of stewardship, to understand how you personally process stress, how you handle it, and then essentially from there, give you some tools to do it. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 10-minute break. It's going to be, again, another informal break. On page 9 of your participant guide, there is a stress reaction journal. And let me just double check something. Yeah, so that's on page 9 of your participant guide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy those questions and put them into the chat. They're not for you to respond to in the chat. This is a personal reflection time, but I want you guys to have the questions if you need them. And so I'm going to put them in the chat. And I want you guys to take 10 minutes and actually write out the answers. I think it's important to consider how you personally process stress. And this is the time for you guys to spend some time figuring out some self-awareness about what types of situations cause you stress. And then we'll go over some tools to handle it. So I'm going to be popping those questions into the chat. And I want you to take about 10 minutes. So we'll reconvene at 10 after. But again, we're not going to take a formal break. We're just going to put, you know what I'm going to do, actually? I'm going to share the participant guide. I think that's the easiest way to do it. So stand by, guys, and I'll show you. They're on page 9 of the participant guide. And then for those of you who can't read or see it, I will add them into the chat. So take some time, write out the questions. You can type them out. You can write shorthand. You can do it on paper and pen, but you can do it in the notes section of your phone if you're on a mobile, but actually write it out. Don't just go through the motions, and we'll convene in about 12 minutes. All 7 questions are in the chat for those of you who can't read the participant guide virtually. All right, for those of you who are still here, haven't taken your break yet, feel free to use the bathroom, take some food. We'll reconvene formally in 5 minutes, but I'm gonna focus on 2 questions for the chat, number 2 and number 5. I'm gonna repost them in the chat now. And that's what I wanna hear you guys share on. What happens to you physically when you feel stress? I wanna hear some responses on that, and feel free to also or only address, how do you de-stress? What are some tips you use physically, emotionally, and mentally to manage your stress? And again, I've reposted those into the chat, number 2 and number 5, for some conversation. So head over there and start working on some responses, and we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes to go over them and move on to the next part of this course. All right, for those of you just joining us, we're asking you to put in some responses on what you feel physically when you feel stress. How do you know that stress is in your body? And what do you do to de-stress? One of the responses has been taking advantage of the gym at the port, doing physical fitness time as part of that program. So I'm glad to hear you're taking advantage of that. Obviously, working out is a great way to de-stress. Yeah, I love that. At a high level of stress, I know I'm stressed because I lose clarity. Yes, and confusion is pretty common when stress becomes overwhelming. So take a few more minutes to finish your stress reaction journal questions for yourself, and share again for questions 2 and 5 in the chat. Yeah. So if you haven't headed over to the chat, head over now. I appreciate, I don't want to botch everybody's names. I appreciate the feedback that those in the chat are participating. A lot of common themes in the chat, and from my research on this: feeling stress in the body, physical fatigue, pain in the chest, headaches, tension behind the eyes, sweaty palms, increased body heat. Those are all well research ways that stress physically manifests in the body. And we're going to go over this a little bit more in the next segment. But what I wanted to say is that this is important for you to build your awareness, because for everyone it's different. Some people say they feel fatigued or tired. Some people say that they feel exhausted or irritable. So it's just important for you to understand how stress manifests for you. I will have you, Samira, begin the slideshow now on slide 40. And then the second question is, how do people de-stress? One common theme we're seeing here is exercise, talking to people, finding a friend to vent to. You know, I'll give you a couple other tips. The number one way to sort of self-regulate stress is sleep. That is by far the best. But of course, we all can't control our sleep challenges, or if you night shift or some alternative shift, go for a bike ride, get some fresh air. Someone also talked about meditation, which we're going to go over a little bit soon. And then also crying the expression out. Hitting a punching bag is another good example. But there's a lot of research that emotions have three parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and knowing how you can process through that. I get on a cycling bike. I get on a bike and just start biking it out. And even if I don't know what stress is consciously aware, by the time I get off the bike, I feel better. Some of that's endorphins from exercise, but a lot of people find that movement of the body helps processing emotions. And that's why things like yoga are incredibly popular now. So what I want to talk about is a tool that I can teach you that you can do in the workplace if you can't get to the gym, if you can't go see your family, if you can't get into nature, and also a tool that I think that you can teach employees when they feel overwhelmed and stressed. And so a little bit is, yes, I love what Lisa's saying about gratitude. There's a lot of research about an active practice of gratitude. So writing down the things you're grateful for, spending a moment of time listing them in your mind. There's a lot of research to show that gratitude can be quite the antidote to whatever negative emotion you're currently experiencing. So I'm going to talk to you guys about two tools. The first one is called NAME, and the second one is the ABCs of breath. And you guys haven't had a training with me, but if I'm giving you an acronym, it's because it really works and it's really helpful. So first, we're going to talk about NAME, and you should write this down if you'd like. It's a 4-step cognitive behavioral technique. It's from a book called The Confidence Gap by Dr. Russ Harris. It's a high recommend for me. And what it talks about is the first N is notice. So that's the question I just asked you. Notice where your stress is showing up in your body. And different emotions often show up in different ways. So for me, anxiety shows up in chest tightness, but anger shows up in sweaty palms or heart racing. Sadness shows up in headaches and tension behind the eyes or crying. So it's important to sort of build your depth awareness of which emotions, not just stress generally, but stress is not an emotion, it's an after effect of emotion. So which emotions are causing what body to sort of respond. So the first step is to notice that. The second step is acknowledge, and you can acknowledge this out loud if you're in private, or you can write it down, but it's literally to name the emotion that you're feeling. And the research shows that the naming of emotion actually helps processing it. It's part of the way our brain works in terms of categories. So we like to name things, we like to put context on things as humans. It's the same part of our brains that many of you are saying, well, you like to talk to a friend or get it out or express it. So the acknowledge part would be like, let's say I'm feeling anxious about something. I would say, okay, I'm feeling some chest tightness. The second step of name would be acknowledging. So right now I feel anxious, and just saying that out loud or writing it down if you're not in a place where you want, it will help you sort of bring your awareness to the emotional state that your body is. We're not our emotions. Emotions pass through us all the time. And then make space. This is a breathing technique. It's about breathing into that until it subsides. So until your heart rate sort of comes down a little bit, until you feel some of the tension release. And this can take quite some time depending on the severity of the emotion. So if someone pisses you off a little bit, it could take like a minute. If it's something bigger or something triggering or something where there's prior trauma, it could take several minutes, 5, 10, 15 minutes, something like that. And then expand your awareness. It means to disengage with whatever's going on that's creating the stress, like the anxiety, and to think about what's actually in your awareness. So you can distract yourself by getting back to work, picking up the phone and calling a friend, looking at what's in your purview. If you're outside, paying attention to the air, the smells, the sound, the sight. It's rechanneling your brain past what the emotional state is into what's actually in your awareness. And this is like I said, it's a cognitive behavioral technique. It's well researched and founded, and I highly encourage you guys to practice it and to share it because it's something that can really be very helpful for people. For the make space, for those of you who aren't familiar with breathing techniques, I'm going to go over the ABCs of breath. This can be found in your participant guide on page 10. And I'm going to sort of demo it for you now. So I'm going to put on my video and we'll begin. So let's see if you guys can see me. So the first part of ABCs for breath is just this idea that you can do this anytime. You can step out of a tense meeting. You can take a break with an employee during an investigatory interview. When employees get emotional and reactive and nervous, that's when they tend to say things that they say in an investigatory interview that can get them in more challenging situations. It's a 3 to 5 minute exercise generally. And it's about building resilience. So I want to sort of ground down in that. It's the capacity to prepare for, recover, and adapt in the face of stress, challenge, or adversity. That is what the definition of resilience is. And this is a technique designed to bring that over time. It's a practice. The first time you do it, it may feel really weird. You don't have to do this, but it's something so simple that you can share with others. So the first thing you want to do is alignment of your body. It doesn't really matter if you're standing or sitting. What matters, let me see if I can see my own screen here. Hold on 1 second. Is that your spine is straight. Give me a second. So it just matters shoulders back. Now I also can stand up. Let's see if this works. Just give me a second. Now we're standing. You guys can see me a little bit better. So the spine is straight. That's what matters. You can be sitting in a chair flat-footed. You can be standing up. And the reason why is because you want to make sure the breath is going up and down, traveling up and down your spine in a straight way. It also helps you. You can do breathing techniques lying down, but often if you're sleep deprived, as so many of us are, people fall asleep, which is great. But that's not necessarily the goal of this exercise. So that's the first thing. So I'll ask you guys to get aligned. We're going to do it together. So find yourself sitting up in a chair, stand up if you need to shake off some of the training exhaustion. And we're going to take B, breaths, right? There's a few different ways you can take breaths. I'm going to teach you 2 or 3 different ways. There's no right or wrong here. This is whatever works for you. So, the 2 main ways you can do it is you can count what's called a breath cycle, or you can count the length of your breath. And I'm going to demo for you both of them, but just give me a moment because I'm talking and I'm not breathing. So let me catch my breath. Okay, so a breath cycle is like this. Inhale, exhale, and then in your mind you just say 1. Inhale, exhale, 2. That's if you want to count breath cycles. Also, what's recommended is counting your breath. And the easiest count I'll recommend to you is 4 and 6. For de-stressing, your exhale is more related to that from a physiological perspective. So you always want your exhale to be longer than your inhale. So you'll inhale for 4 and exhale for 6. And ideally, if you can, you should be breathing in and out of your nose. So I'll demo that for you now. Inhale on a count of 4. Exhale. It's hard to hear because I don't have headphones in because of the way the sound works, but hopefully you can hear my breathing a little bit. C is for close your eyes or count your breath length, depending if you're not comfortable closing your eyes. But the research shows that if you can close your eyes, you're limiting your sensory intake. So you're focusing more on your breath. And then often people will picture a person that they love, a child, a spouse, a place that they love being, an activity they love doing. This is sort of combining the power of the research of pulling in gratitude at the same time of breath, and it helps slow down sort of the space between your heart rate. Your breath sends that message to your brain that you are calm and safe and that the emotion you're experiencing isn't actually threatening to you. And then the D is depict something in your mind. And if you get distracted, this is a very common feedback from people when they first start taking breath work or doing some meditation. They're like, I'm thinking about other things. I can't stop thinking about this thing at work or this to-do list. That's totally okay. Meditation's actually a muscle. So it's about recognizing that you've lost your count and getting back to it. So that's why C is for counting as well, because if you can't remember what breath cycle you are on, or you lost count and you're breathing in for 12 and out for 2, then you went somewhere else and you weren't really in the breath work. So it's just a cue for yourself to build this muscle. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you guys to do this with me. I'm going to set an alarm, and I'm not going to tell you for how long the alarm is going. And I'm going to ask you to ABCD with me. And I want you to take stock of how you feel right now. If you feel lethargic, cranky, exhausted, it doesn't have to be specific, and then we're going to do this together. And then I'm going to ask you to consider how you feel after it. So align your body and then decide if you're going to count by cycle, inhale, exhale 1, inhale, exhale 2, or you're going to count by breath, 1, 2, 3, 4 in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Your own count is fine. Close your eyes, try to bring something to your mind. And if you get distracted, don't judge yourself, don't criticize yourself, just get back into it. And we'll see how you're feeling. All right, so let's begin. All right, so now I'll ask you guys to come into the chat and tell me if that felt long or short and how long you think we did that for. Good, I love the feedback. So all different answers. For timing today, I did it for 1 minute. So many of you are right, but I will tell you, I do this experiment a lot. And if I do it for 2 or 3 minutes, people feel like it is an eternity. And part of what that is has to do with if you've ever done breath work before, but people don't realize how long a minute really is until they're timing it. So something to consider is that you can do this for just 2 or 3 minutes and it makes quite a difference. And this is sort of to get at the idea of like, oh, I don't have time to meditate. I don't have time to take a deep breath. I don't have time to take a break in this meeting. You do have that time. And now I want to ask people how they felt before and after. It was only a minute, so I don't expect the effects to be too strong. But can you tell me, did you feel the same, better, worse? Did you feel one emotion before? I'll tell you as the instructor, I felt a lot of pent up energy before I was breathing. And then as I was breathing, I feel a lot calmer now because I've had a moment to like decompress from the stress of teaching all morning. But yeah, I'd love to hear how you feel, especially if you've never done anything like this. So I'll give you guys a minute to pop those feedbacks into the chat. 1 more minute for feedback. Yeah, better because it grounds you, right? So this is based on a lot of the science that's coming out in the last few years, which is we always think we start work with our heads. Our heads control everything in our bodies. But the reality is that's not actual science. We know that our heart sends a lot more messages to our brain than our brain says to our heart. And by using your breath, what you're doing is slowing down not your heartbeat, but you're creating more regular space between your heartbeats. The more you breathe, instead of having a heartbeat happen irregularly, it moves to a regular heart beating pattern in the intervals between your heartbeat. And that sends a message to your brain that you're calm. Yeah. Somebody said too relaxed. I don't know if that's such a thing. But yeah, so this is just an idea for you guys to feel like, okay, you don't have to be a meditation teacher or like go to, study in India or Nepal to teach breathing techniques. This is a basic technique that's grounded in some strong science that you can share. And I'll also drop into the chat, there's a really great monitor it's called the HeartMath monitor, and it's a Bluetooth monitor that plugs into any device like a phone, and it has a monitor that you clip to your ear, and it measures the space between your heartbeats. And that helps you figure out if what HeartMath calls you're in coherence, meaning that you're in alignment, your mental, your emotional, and your physical body to make in a good place. So for me, this is just a great practice before I do something that's intimidating, especially as new stewards. If you're going to go into your first grievance meeting or a difficult grievance meeting or a stressful situation, do some deep breaths. When you take a bathroom break, take some of these deep breaths. You don't need to be sitting on a yoga mat to have some breath work in the workplace. And so I hope you guys share this. And I hope that this was a positive experience for you. We're going to finish off our tools to manage stress with slide 41, Samira. We're not going to have time to go over this today just because we had the cut in the schedule, but there's something called the social support exercise in your participant guide. I want you guys to look at it. There's a lot of science to show, as you guys all identified in the chat. Oh, I spend time with my family, or I talk to my friends, that a big part of stress resiliency is social support. And so in the guide, we've provided you some considerations on what type of social support we're talking about. And again, this is something you can share directly with grievance. I'm looking at page 11. And basically it's to take some time to really see who fills these roles for you. Not just to be like, oh, I have great family or I have great friends, but like, who do you trust with secrets? Who do you laugh to? Who do you go to for guidance? Who can you actually cry on without cry on their shoulder without judgment? Who is the person that you get excited about your future with? And these are the types of social support that are really important for you as a steward as you take on some of this stress, but also especially for grievance in removal situations or really long-term cases where it's a very big emotional drain to be under investigation for a long time or to be litigating for your job back or something like that. So these are tools to sort of bring their awareness to things that can help support them socially during stress. The other thing I wanted to spend a little bit time on before we move on, which we don't have as much time as I'd like, but this is really, really critical. It's on page 12 of your guide. And it's this idea that everybody's urgency in the workplace often is an emergency. Oh, I had this thing happen to me yesterday. I need to file a grievance. I need you to get involved. And often stewards, especially newer stewards and newer leaders, struggle with setting this tone of like, your urgency is not my emergency. Every single thing people want from the workplace from an NTEU steward has some level of importance and urgency. It's about basically having a tool to sort of say, hey, like, oh, I'm going on leave next week, or my shift's ending, or I can't get official time today, so I can't talk to you about this today because I'm, whatever, looking, clearing a container or whatever your role is for the agency. This idea that you need to create space between people's urgencies and actual emergencies. And so there are 4 practical tips that we give you in the guide. The first thing I'd always recommend is start with dependencies and deadlines. So whenever someone tells me about a situation they have, the first thing I ask is when it happened. I know my contract deadlines, and I know that I have weeks or hours to take an action. Then affect what action or inaction will have. Something's already happened in the past. There's no way to, there's no way to fix it now but a grievance. Well, you have 45 days. An employee got, pulled inappropriately to unanticipated overtime, and they were supposed to have the day off with their kid, and now they're coming to you, and that overtime is Saturday. Well, you could still get involved, and therefore there's more urgency to sort of prevent the harm. And then if there's a high risk of damage or there's a thing you can do, then it is your emergency and you need to get official time. And if you can't, you need to pass it to your chapter. But it should be building your comfort with saying no or rescheduling their emergency. Because if you're not competent and confident in doing this over time, people's urgencies can inundate a steward. So take a look at the guide. It has some more effectual language on that. But I just wanted to encourage you all to get comfortable with literally the mantra, your urgency is not my emergency. Whether you say that to them or you say it to yourself, it depends on the relationship. But for certain, it's really important that you get comfortable with this concept, because it is for sure going to show up for you, because it's just the nature of these issues. And often I see leaders and stewards scrambling to pull all the things together and then to find out that, we have weeks to do that, not hours. And that's when things bleed in past shift, things bleed into taking home. Often there are emergencies, but they're not as often as the issues that arise at the port seem like they are. So now we're gonna move into the last main segment that we're gonna talk about, which is the roles of a steward. We have about an hour left together, so I'm going to do my best to finish this within the hour to accommodate the schedule change. So what we're going to do now is talk about the roles of the steward. This is going to be a 10-minute video from National that we're going to play. We're going to go over in the roles of the steward, most of them with some experience you'll be familiar with. And then we're going to really end on what, like I said, I think is the most actionable content here, which is the tools to build strong relationships as you continue in your steward journey. So I'm going to stop sharing my video now, and I'm going to ask Samira to stop sharing so I can share the next video.
Hi, I'm Tony Reardon, NTEU National President. You know, for many members, you are not just an NTEU steward, you are NTEU. You are the direct line for information about workplace issues and NTEU efforts to improve the lives of federal employees. You are an advocate and a champion for their rights and the enforcer of their contract. You help identify workplace problems and you find solutions. And other times, you're there to be a listening ear. See, you help provide stability and hope in the workplace. You are essential to the success of our union, and I thank each and every one of you for your leadership. Being a steward requires you to use a variety of your skills and talents in order to be successful. But these skills do not stand alone. They work together and flow into each other, one layering on top of the other, until you seamlessly pull together the pieces that you need to handle any situation. So, let's get started.
Stewards are communicators. Being able to communicate well is the linchpin to everything you will do as a steward. As the link between employees and NTEU, it's your job to share news from the union, update them on legislative issues, and keep your ear to the ground for developing workplace issues. Stewards need to keep members informed of the news and developments that impact their workplace rights and benefits. That could mean anything from congressional legislation impacting their retirement, to new provisions in their contract, to changes in employee parking. Information doesn't just flow one way. Part of your job is to listen to employees and understand what's happening in the workplace, good and bad. Then you pass that information to your chapter president. This flow of information lets NTEU get in front of issues and helps remind members of the valuable role that NTEU plays in their working lives. Stewards are educators. As a steward, you're an employee's first point of contact with NTEU. Employees will come to you with questions on countless workplace matters. They may have an issue with a manager or a question about anything from leave to their performance appraisal. Employees often don't understand or know all of their workplace rights. You'll find yourself educating them on what's in the contract or federal law and how it applies to them or their particular situation. Don't be surprised if you end up educating managers too. They don't get the training you do. You won't always have the answer to a question at your fingertips, and that's okay. You have people to turn to, other stewards, your chapter leaders, and your field office. They're there to help. Don't be afraid to ask them. Even the longest-serving stewards will tell you they're still learning new things every day. And you will too. Stewards as advocates. Perhaps one of the most meaningful roles in being an NTEU steward is that of advocate. You have the power to help an employee who has been treated unfairly at work and ensure that others aren't exposed to that same unfair treatment. This may be the most frustrating and most rewarding role you'll take on as a steward. You may speak on behalf of employees in one-on-one conversations with managers, at formal meetings, and in investigatory interviews. Employees will look to you for information, assurance, and guidance. You'll be across the table from managers, but keep in mind that you are their equals when you're advocating for an employee. NTEU always tries to solve problems at the lowest possible level, and that should be your goal. Some problems are simply the result of miscommunication or a lack of understanding, while others may become elevated to a grievance. However the situation resolves, employees will be grateful you were by their side. Stewards are negotiators. As a steward, you may be asked to serve as a member of an NTEU bargaining team negotiating local issues. More likely, you're also playing the role of a negotiator when resolving grievances. You will be the voice of employees, representing their interests before management, with the goal of improving working conditions and benefits. A good negotiator understands that there are two sides at the table. You speak for employees, and they're counting on you to be their voice. You must keep an open mind and always remember the bigger picture. If an opportunity for compromise arises, always consider it. You may not leave with everything you wanted, but management likely won't either. Negotiating is both an art and a science. It requires you to be able to put the immediate issue into the larger context of workplace rights and benefits. Approach any negotiations as a problem-solving exercise. That's what it is. Sitting across from management can be intimidating at first, but this is another situation in which you are an equal. Many stewards enjoy negotiating because they find this behind-the-scenes work to be fulfilling as they resolve specific issues that impact employees' everyday work lives. Stewards are recruiters. We are stronger together, and increasing our membership is a daily activity for a steward. One of the most common reasons non-members give for not belonging to the union is that they were never asked. Your job is to ask them. New employees don't know much, if anything, about unions or NTEU. They're unfamiliar with NTEU's rich history of fighting for employee rights and how we have improved their workplace, or the importance of collective action in supporting our efforts. It's a different scenario for employees who have been around for a long time but have never joined the union. They may have a litany of reasons, but personal conversations are the key to overcoming them. There are plenty of resources on TEU.org to help you with recruitment, including flyers and guides like Responding to Doubters. Membership is the lifeblood of NTEU, and we need a strong union with strong membership so our voice in Congress and with federal agencies is loud and strong.
Hi, I'm Jim Bailey, NTEU's National Executive Vice President. As you've just heard, leadership takes on many shapes and forms for NTEU stewards in the workplace. It began when you made the decision to join NTEU and demonstrated the importance of membership. Now, as a steward, you provide an example of the importance of being involved and active in the union. You will learn and develop new skills and talents as an NTEU steward. You will be a leader in your workplace and someone who employees will count on. As an NTEU steward, you are never alone. You join a cadre of stewards who are the best trained and the most effective advocates in the federal government. And you have the support of a network of experienced NTEU leaders across the country. You also have the support of NTEU's professional staff working in our headquarters office and in your field office. I want to personally thank you for stepping up, making this commitment to your colleagues, and taking on the mantle of leadership.
We're wrapping up here, coming in the home stretch before our lunch break. I say that because I know you guys are in all different time zones, but that's coming up in about 45 minutes. Samir, I'll have you start on slide 42. So what we're going to talk about now is how to grow your impact in the workplace. So we've talked about why you want to make a positive impact, how to measure it in terms of perception and performance. And now we're going to talk about the roles that support that. Primarily the role that most early stewards or stewards see early in their stewarding careers is representational advocacy work. So the video talks about, and you may be familiar with these other things like negotiator, communicator, educator. To me, communication and education are really a part of everything. But specifically, we're now going to focus on advocacy. So formal meetings is an area where, and I'm on page 13 of the participant guide. Formal meetings is an area where new stewards have often the opportunity to create their perception, to build the brand of the local chapter, and to sort of get involved in the things that are going on. That essentially could be, a formal meeting could be a muster, it could be a group meeting, a team meeting, a work unit meeting. We're going to talk a little bit more about those in detail. And there's also a lot of this is covered in extensive detail in grievance handling. So we're just going to do a high level view right now before we dive into the last part of our class on relationship building. Informal issues, this is the other place where we see grievance really get involved in advocacy. People bring their issues to them. It's important that you build a process to investigate the complaint, ask the right kind of questions, open-ended questions, take good notes, understanding the motivations that bring an employee to bring a case, because sometimes it's based on personality, it's a personal issue, sometimes it's a genuine misunderstanding. That's why informal resolutions often occur, and sometimes it's general dissatisfaction, or it's a specific issue that we actually need to file a grievance on. It's important that you ask clarifying questions. What I like to do is ask grievance to tell me the whole story from start to finish, and then I take a lot of notes. I process on those notes, and then when I meet with them next, I repeat back to them what I think that they told me. It's a tool for me to understand if they've forgotten anything, if there's any communication gaps between us, and to make sure I have all the facts. So it's a great tool for you to do. And there's also A through G lists some specific steps that you can go over. To me, the most important part of advocacy at your level is setting, managing, and meeting expectations. It's really important that employees understand expectations in terms of your follow-up, like we discussed, I'll be back to you in X number of days, that they understand that just because we file a grievance doesn't mean we prevail or we take that to arbitration. It's really important that typical sales sort of lingo, but like, under promise and over deliver, not over promise and under deliver. That's where we see issues of perception and performance become pretty challenging and toxic to a chapter, is when stewards or leaders promise something they can't deliver on. Very rarely, in my experience at least, I've never seen much employee dissatisfaction when we stated the expectations up front early that we thought this would be a challenging case, or we weren't sure we'd have a case. And it's really important that you remember that a grievance doesn't mean everything that's unfair. There's a lot of unfairness that is not grievable. That doesn't mean it's fair. It just means that that's not the right place to bring that issue, that it may be more suitable for a labor management forum or a specific national committee to be discussed. What I'd like to do now is move to slide 43 and talk a little bit about formal meetings. There's more information on formal meetings. If you have questions on what they are, when they occur, how does your chapter get involved in them? Each chapter sort of has local practices on that, so I won't get into the details on it. But in CBP, I think based on the regimented nature of the port, this is not a super challenging issue for this unit, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. But essentially, these are some goals that we have from formal meetings, right? We want to look at things like increasing the visibility of NTEU. This goes for the idea that NTEU is aware of what the change is, the local chapters, advocating for change. Number two is really important at the port level. Often I see my leaders get better schedules in the BRP, make good negotiations with management. And then when management says, oh, they're doing this, they fail to mention that it was the local chapter that brought all of those positives. So one of the rules of formal meetings is to get credit for the chapter when that's appropriate. It builds the importance of membership and the value of membership to our members. Obviously, if there's anything illegal, going on at that meeting, like inappropriate questioning or something like that, you could get involved. But really a lot of it is number 7 through 10, right? You're going to learn about what other people are saying are problems when you attend these meetings. It's important that you question, clarify, and ask for information, especially if it's a high-level CBP leader that's coming through, the EACs coming through, something like that. Your chapter leaders, especially your chapter presidents, will likely be asking questions, clarifying information of what they've heard about, XTDY or Y issue. And then it's also an opportunity to build relationships both within your unit and also with these repeat players, these managers that you're going to have repeat relationships with. So it's important that you go into that understanding you want to be representative of employees, but you don't want to be so representative and so intense about that representation that you're unable to build relationships across the aisle with management. Next slide, please. We're going to talk now about the organizer and recruiter a little bit. These are the main roles, like I said, that support representation. So it's the idea that, okay, well, your advocacy is your main role, or the role you seek most often, but how do you amplify the power of that representational impact? Because we're still talking about impact. And the two ways you can do that best are organizing around an issue and recruiting people as members into the union, because dues-paying members are the people that most engage with us. They give us the most information. They're often the people who testify at hearings and the like. So it's important to understand how those two things work together. And so, again, this is covered in the participant guide for your reference. We are now on page, I believe it's 14. I'm sorry, it's 15. So we're on page 15. Let's talk a little bit about what organizing means. I said at the beginning of this class, this is a term of art. In the labor movement. It doesn't mean organizing your closet, though, honestly, what a great thing. I'm a big fan of cleaning and organizing. But organizing is specifically about building momentum around an issue and deepening our understanding and depth of an issue by working directly with our members and those engaged with our mission. And it's about community building and building solidarity. So a very common organizing adage is information prompts interest, which in turn promotes involvement. And those 3 I's are really important. Information prompts interest, which prompts involvement. And that is what is at the heart of organizing. What information are you disseminating to your bargaining unit about an issue that prompts their interest and then engagement or involvement? Oh, I also was skipped in this way on the call out sheet. I also have this same problem with leave. That's how you build cases in width, in breadth instead of depth, right? That's mass grievances, that's which work units is a problem with, which shifts, and getting the more people to engage on that issue will build the strength of that case. And so that is a really key thing. Some things you want to consider on, depending on your exact chapter makeup, is understanding who's in your bargaining unit and who's not. Who's in your bargaining unit that's a dues-paying member and who's not. Dues-paying members get access to information that non-paying members don't. Understanding, who in your area is an officer, agricultural specialist, does your chapter represent any people in OT? And then learning what interests different members from recruitment conversations. So often people, when they join or when they're not joining, and this translates right into recruitment, you should be asking them why they're joining or what part of union membership spoke to them when they're signing in 1187. It's good for you to know what your membership cares about. That's one of the primary roles of your stewards in a chapter, is ears on the ground, leading from amongst the front line. And then the second thing we know is, and this is less true at CBP, we see pretty high membership across the board at CBP, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but if someone's not joining, I think it's an opportunity to learn. So if someone says, no, I'm not joining, or never follows up with you when you send them an 1187, ask them why, because if there's something we can be doing to demonstrate value, you're going to miss that opportunity if you don't ask them why not. So those are sort of the supportive roles to membership. Some recruitment tools that we go over on page 16 is what is an ask. Talking on Tuesday is this idea that you should try to talk to one non-member a week. I use talking on Tuesday just because it's an alliteration, and it's an easy to remember. Obviously, many of you don't have fixed RDOs, and that's not necessarily practical for you. But the idea is that you should be continually having recruitment conversations as a steward, even though CBP has very high membership. Very few chapters are anywhere near 100%, and one of my chapters is at 100% membership pretty often, between 90 and 100%, and they continuously recruit because they lose people to different spots in the agency. They get new trainees coming in. So it is a process. It's not a static achievement. The other thing I'll talk about an ask can be, hey, sign up, here's a form. That's a very traditional ask, but it can be like, what matters to you in the union? What value can we provide? Having a conversation about union membership is an ask, even if it doesn't end in a question mark or end in a prompt. So, and you should have some recruitment targets. Know who in your work unit is not a member and figure out what matters to them and if we can respond to them. There are tons of tools for recruitment on NTEU.org. If you don't already have an NTEU.org login, let me make a quick plug. You should have that. You should set that up now that you're a steward. All members have that, but especially a steward, there's lots of tools. There's flyers on different programs that NTEU is running that support recruitment. And there's a document called Respond to Doubters, which goes over the 10 most common reasons people say that they don't want to join the union and gives you some practical ways to continue the conversation with them, despite their initial resistance to joining the union. So we will now move to how we strengthen our voice. So first, we've been talking about strengthening our representation. Now we're talking about building collective power. And this is the heart of the labor movement. And like what I said, I think the key part of this class. So before I move on to that, and that will be, I'm just going to go over a couple quick slides and see if anyone has any questions in the chat. So I'm going to stop my video. And let's do slides 45, Samira. And if you guys have any questions about organizing or recruitment, there are some issues with the questions tab that I'm not super familiar with. So pop your questions in the chat while I go over these next few slides. So this is also something really important to ground into organizing in your role in communicating to the bargaining unit, which is that often people will say, well, this doesn't affect me. This doesn't affect my unit. This doesn't affect my shift. This doesn't affect me. I'm non-uniformed. It's really important that you build solidarity across our unit and candidly at NTEU across our agencies. It's why we sort of point to you that CBP is one agency within 33. Our issues that our members face at different agencies and within different port environments, airport, seaport, et cetera, they're all different. But what we have in common is our power, our collective power, and our commitment to sort of the labor movement at its core. And so that is something I think that we don't spend enough time talking to our stewards about, how they should be sort of discussing this belief that underlies the labor movement. Just like Simon Sinek says, it's part of the why of NTEU, and therefore it's part of your leadership as a steward at NTEU. And so this is just a great quote that I love to hone into it, that sometimes people have to stand up because it doesn't matter, that it's not a right that matters to you. You're not an overtimed employee. Why do you care about an Article 35 violation? You don't bid, or you're locked into your work unit for 2 years. So why do you care what happens with the bid this year? But that's sort of the collective power of dues, the collective power of, we have to take different cases that represent different issues, remembering that we're advancing the ball for everybody. I don't see any questions in the chat. I'm going to leave 1 more minute for that because I want to make sure we address your questions. Other good resources I want to go over. There's an electronic 1187. I will pop that into the chat if you're not familiar with that. That's something that NTEU launched very on in the pandemic. We were the first federal labor union to set up an electronic version of it. So no more goes the excuse, I don't have a pen, I don't have a paper, I don't have time. People can sign up from their personal mobiles. They just put in some personal information. And then on the back end, the system populates the 1187 and submits it to the agency. If your local leadership, a lot of CBP chapters still process 1187s either electronically and securely send them, or with a 3-carbon copy or 1 copy scanned and sent into national and the agency's point of contact. So check with your local leadership about how you do that. And, you know, something to consider is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. The longer you're a steward, sometimes people forget why someone would be a non-member. So remember to understand that their perception of the union could be based on a previous steward, a previous term, a previous elected officer. And so engaging them in why they're feeling what they're feeling is really important in terms of non-membership. And also understanding that some of these conversations are going to be more challenging in a remote world, even though most of you are at the port. You're at least hopefully spread out from people and seeing less people for your safety, but that also means it's harder to have some of these conversations one-on-one. Any other questions? I don't see any questions on organizing or on recruitment. I'll just share one thing. There's a lot of ways to create an ask or a pitch, but one of the ones I've heard the best recently I want to share is when someone asks, you know, why should I join the union? I get all the benefits for free, or I get the contract for free, or I can bid for free, or whatever, you know, all of that sort of what we call someone focusing on the free benefits instead of the collective power. One of the best responses I ever heard was this: our union isn't just about fighting management or protecting people in trouble. It's about building a community of people at work who care about work and about each other. Instead of thinking of the union as a vending machine where you put in money to get back representation or contract protections, think of the union like a gym membership. What you put in directly impacts what you get from it. Your access to baseline protections is the beginning of what the union does for you. It's not anywhere near its highest potential to improve your work life. And so I think that just sort of goes to this trend we're seeing, that more people say, well, I don't need this. I'm not going to get in trouble. I'm not going to get jammed up by management. This is a different type of recruitment approach. So I wanted to share that with you all. And now in our last half an hour, we're going to go get to some of my favorite content, if you couldn't tell, which is the relationship building content. At the end of the day, our voice in the workplace is strengthened. Next slide, please. We'll do slide 47, Samira, 2 slides ahead. Our voice in the workplace is all about relationships. And it's not just about relationships, it's about relationships that are based in trust and based in empathy. And like integrity, and we talked about earlier, we're going to get back into it. I'm not just throwing out these words like trust and empathy. I'm going to go into what they mean and where we see problems with them, so you guys have some practical tools to like build your skill set at building trust-based relationships with both management, your other chapter leaders, and also members and non-members. And so the first slide here is just to show you, you know, everything you do is about relationships. Your relationship with grievance, your relationship with other chapter leaders within your chapter and at other chapters, your relationship with managers, members, a new potential steward. It is endless. And so that is why we've spent so much time on Batari box and how you interact with others, the parts of a message with your tone and your body language, because these all are fundamentals to how you build relationships in your newer role as a steward. Next slide, please. So what I will say is this is one of the slides I think that has the most information, something you may find the most practical to look back at. It is your responsibility as a steward to both create trust and to prevent trust breaks with yourself. And so there's a great book called Trustology that I read several years ago, but it talks about how, well, when people say they don't trust somebody, they're usually talking about like a gut feeling that they don't trust somebody, but that's not very helpful to say, oh, I don't trust the port director. I do trust the steward. I don't trust this employee. And employees feel that way about stewards. Oh, I don't trust this steward. That steward has a negative perception. I trust that steward. So here are some tools to sort of diagnose and to prevent trust issues from happening with you in your stewardship role. The first, there are 3 areas of trust, and we're going to talk about them separately: competency, integrity, and compassion. Competency, this is like traditional trust issues. This is like, I don't think you know what you're talking about. I question if you are competent. So solutions to that trust break are, number one, acknowledging what you don't know, setting expectations up front. Knowledge brokering, as we've discussed, which is saying, okay, I don't know, but let me find out who does know. I do that all the time. I don't know everything. We only know what we've experienced, and there are issues that happen in my territory that have not happened other places in this country, and there are issues that have happened other places in this country that have not happened in my territory. So finding out who knows what and how it's gone is really part of where we're at generationally. Everybody can Google something, but it's about brokering relationships to get the knowledge you need. This is also true at the port. Who can you build a relationship with? Maybe it's the chief of staff of the port director. Maybe it's the APD. Maybe it's a certain SCBPO that has a really high level understanding of what's going on. Where can you get information from your relationships? And that takes time. The other tool I'll share with you is YET. It's a twofold tool. So from a growth mindset perspective, recognizing you don't know something yet, but you will know it. So it's not that you're never going to know it, but just give yourself a chance to learn it. From a communication standpoint, that's what you say to employees. You say, hey, I don't know this yet. Let me look into it. And like I said, in my experience, and I think this is pretty true across the board at NTEU, when you acknowledge you don't know something, but you make a commitment to go find that knowledge and communicate that you don't know it, you're going to find that knowledge and set a plan to communicate, to follow up or close that loop. I've never heard of someone being like, how do you not know this, Jen? You're a field rep of X number of years. The truth is that it builds a ton of credibility to acknowledge that I know what I know and I don't know what I don't know. And I'm very competent in certain areas and my competency needs to be grown and I don't know that yet. So these are some practical takeaways. They're small language cues, but they are really helpful. Resources, your collective bargaining agreement is a 2017 CBA. It is searchable. Look at the table of contents. You can control F it. Remember about the virtual training center if you're not familiar with it. This is a live virtual training conference, but many of these classes have on-demand versions on our virtual training center. So if you go through grievance handling tomorrow and you forgot the thing that they said about X part of that class, you can go back and take a segment of that training again. And you should, because like I said, one-off training doesn't stick. So you're not going to remember everything we've gone over today just from this class. Find the points that you think are the most relevant, study them, go back and check them out. The virtual training center set up where the lessons are 5 to 15 to 20 minutes. So it's not like a big 4-hour block like this. You can really just go refresh on formal meetings or go refresh on how to file an information request or whatever your questions are, because many of you will be stewards for a while and you won't see an Article 35 or an Article 13 grievance for quite some time. So it's important that you recognize that you have the training resources to support you when those issues are close in time. You don't need to memorize everything in April just because this is when the training happened. So that's competency. Integrity is the next area that you may need to diagnose. You have an issue with a manager's integrity or another employee's integrity, or you want to prevent trust issues happening with your integrity. And as you guys so articulately know, right, especially those of you who said integrity and consistency is your number one value. Integrity is about if your words aligning with your actions. So how do you, and I think this was raised, keeping your word. But it doesn't mean keeping your word absolutely. It's impossible to keep your word absolutely. There will be circumstances in this environment that preclude you from keeping your word. You file a grievance, that grievance gets consolidated at the local level, national decides to do something different with that grievance. Or you recommend a case for arbitration to your chapter leader, but your chapter executive board does not want to pay for that arbitration at hearing because of X, Y, and Z issues. So there's going to be plenty of things out of your control. So what you want to do is maintain flexibility and keep your word to follow up. So you say things like, I'm not making any promises that this case goes to arbitration, but I'm going to do my best to advocate for that. I'm not sure the outcome of this issue, or I'm not sure we can get you a letter of reprimand with a 30-day suspension. That's quite a large reduction, but we're certainly going to try. And so I think focusing on your efforts rather than outcome and using language that suggests flexibility is really important. The other tool I'll recommend here is about setting expectations and defining the sphere of confidentiality. Expectations are about setting the process up, expectations for a grievance, who funds those grievances, etc. But the sphere of unit confidentiality is something I see that breaks employees' trust. Employees go to a steward, they tell the steward something they consider to be deeply confidential or personal. That steward then discusses it with the chief steward, the chapter president, or the field rep. And at times, if they don't set the confidentiality sphere expectations up front, an employee could think that you breached their trust. You discussed something with them they weren't supposed to discuss. So it's important up front to talk to employees about what they consider to be confidential. And if they say, I'm only telling you and I came to you, I'll use somebody's name, Claudia. I am only coming to you, Claudia, because I trust you and I don't trust Rachel. It's important that Claudia says, well, I work for, Sarah. Sarah's the chapter president. Rachel's a co-steward of mine. You're bringing something to the union. I need to be able to talk to my colleagues and NTEU National about this issue and understand that there's a confidentiality issue that needs to be navigated for a specific reason. That being said, most chapters operate where employees don't get to pick their stewards. Stewards are assigned to cases based on the workflow of the chapter. So if there's a specific issue that could be a conflict of interest or confidentiality, that's where chapter leadership usually raises it up to NTEU National field reps for guidance. But generally, it's just the failure of stewards to set those expectations up front. You should know I'm not your lawyer. Everything you tell me, I may need to discuss with other people in the union. We will keep your issue confidential within the sphere of the union, but I can't keep, your issue confidential to me. And I do the same thing when I take a case to arbitration. I am not the attorney of the grievant or the chapter. I work for Tony Reardon and I'm legally obligated as attorney-client to his privilege, meaning that I can't hold certain confidences. I would be subject to disclosing them under certain rules. So it's just important that you set those expectations so people know what they can share and how much they can share, especially when it comes to management. Oh, can I share this very sensitive thing with management? Well, maybe not. If it's going to subject them for a fitness for duty test they don't want to be subject to, then maybe that's something you can't share. Or maybe it is something that should be shared because you're asking for an accommodation or mitigating circumstances that are really important. The last area of trust that I think we all have experienced as humans when you don't trust someone is like when you feel like they don't get you. They don't feel like you understand. Their response seems incongruous with how you are feeling about a situation. And what that is a trust issue of compassion, right? It's somebody saying like, oh, I have this really stressful situation at home and X, Y, and Z issue. And I went to EAP and that didn't work. And then my colleague at work committed suicide. And, and the response being like, well, you know what? We all work at CBP and it's tough. That would make someone often feel like they can't trust the union or they can't trust you. And so we're going to talk about a practice of empathy. Empathy is a skill. It's another buzzword we're hearing a lot about, but I'm not going to just talk about it at the high level. I'm going to give you some practical skills, how to avoid creating trust issues based on compassion. And these are also tools you can share with management, meaning, hey, manager, this is a really big trust break, I think, in the union labor world, which is that often port management does not seem to have compassion for the officers, does not seem to understand what serious consequences they create sometimes, and they don't really think about them as humans. They think of you as bodies and numbers. And so this is a tool to sort of build communication to sort of get more favorable outcomes when you can paint a picture of empathy. So we are going to move to, we're already there. Key skill for, thanks, Samira. Key skill for stewards, the practice of empathy. Okay, so why does empathy matter? Essentially, it's all about your ability to relate to other people's emotions. Definitely a lack of empathy at CBP, for sure, but hopefully not amongst our stewards. So the idea is that we have this notion Humans have this notion that we're like these big brain creatures, and all of the stuff in our lives is but because we're so logical and we're so much more evolved than monkeys and all of this stuff. Well, the truth is that's complete false. That's complete myth. The science is super clear that we are actually more emotional beings than logical decision makers as humans. This isn't CBP. This isn't federal employees. This isn't union. This is just humans. And what's really crazy is now we're seeing all this science to show that emotions impact so many things that we never would have thought that they impact. And so I want to bring this to your attention because I think sometimes when people talk about emotions, people check out and they're like, oh, that's fluffy, or oh, that's soft, or oh, that doesn't matter, or like, oh, that's only if you're nice. I mean, that is just completely not true. And what it really does is it impacts a lot of what goes on in the representational world. So the first one is emotions impact what we pay attention to, remember, and learn, i.e. feeling gives meaning to learning. So hopefully some of the things we've been doing today have been bringing up some feelings for you, whether that's the stress reaction journal or some of these TED Talks. You are more likely to remember what we went over if those evoked emotions. How does that impact in the workplace? Well, if an employee has an emotional issue that happened to them and they're recounting the events of that, I had a case just now where there was an altercation between a manager and an employee, and they got essentially into an argument, and it resulted in a suspension and proposal. And when they go over what happened, both the employee and the manager have some memory issues. They were so emotional at that time, they can't remember exactly what happened when. And that's relevant to sort of how the whole facts of the case are playing out. Social relations, I think this is clear, right? If people feel like you can relate to them emotionally, you have a better, stronger relationship within your role as an organization, within your role in the organization. This is really, really interesting decision making. So we always think we make decisions logically, but now we're seeing that the science shows that people make approximately 20,000 decisions a day. I'll repeat that because it's shocking but true, 20,000 decisions. And we see the overwhelming of those, and those of you, actively working in the field know this, that you make a lot of decisions on gut and emotion before you have time to process them. And what the research shows actually is that when we say, oh, I made this decision to use less lethal force because X, Y, and Z, that what's actually going on is our brain creates a narrative to support the emotional decision we made in the moment. And that is really important when the decisions of your leadership at the chapter level or an employee's decision making is coming into question, which happens a lot in representational issues. It also affects your grit, your ability to persist past failure, your effectiveness, and frankly, your performance in any role or capacity. So how you feel about a job affects how well you do it, which is why morale in the workplace is so important and why it's so disappointing that CBP continually doesn't seem to really understand that morale impacts the performance of the agency. It also impacts creativity. So if you're working on a project personally, professionally within the union that requires idea generation or creative work, recognizing how you feel emotionally can you want to feel in a good place before you start that work. And also, as we discussed earlier, all the science just shows that it actually correlates to physiological health. So to that end, the question of how are you feeling is a really powerful one. And often when I'm working with a grievant over a period of time, I can build a relationship. That's where I start. I start with, hey, we haven't talked in a little while. What's going on? How are you feeling? And we talk a lot about the emotional impact of a case or the emotional impact of an investigation. So that's a really powerful tool. So next slide. While I've told you about the practice of empathy, what I haven't told you yet is what it actually is and what it isn't. And so I will have Samira stop sharing in just a moment so I can share this 3-minute clip. And this is our last clip. And it's 3 minutes, but I hope, as you notice, as the time of the clips go down, so does the power of the clips goes up. So I hope this one is a good one. So Samira, I'll have you stop sharing now. And I'll tell you guys that this is from Brene. And if you haven't heard of Brene Brown, write her name down. She's very wise. She's a social scientist and a psychological researcher out of University of Texas, Austin. And this is just an animated clip with her audio in the back, and it goes over what empathy is. So let's listen in.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, marriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now, I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
We have a few questions in the chat. What I'd like to do is wrap up the PowerPoint. We only have a few more slides, and then we can leave some questions in the chat and make sure we can hold true to the break being at 2:30 Eastern, 12:30 Mountain. And if anybody wants to continue the chat, I can stay a little bit longer to discuss that. But let's start on we'll start on slide 51. So what Brene Brown talks about, while Samira's pulling that up, is a couple things, right? The first thing I want you to get from that empathy versus sympathy is one of the ways you can create a trust break is if you sympathize. If, I don't know if it's like a moose or whoever, but if you say, if someone comes to you with a very hard situation, a personal, maybe they're seeking a hardship transfer, maybe they have something going on in their personal life, maybe they have a post-traumatic stress disorder response. And when you're like, at least, oh, you're working too much overtime. Well, at least you get overtime. Half of our other work units don't get overtime, or whatever it is. That is the easiest way for you to create a compassion break. But I also want to talk about what she breaks down as the 4 attributes of empathy. So empathy is a skill that can be practiced, but it has 4 qualities. And these are qualities that begin really challenging. And so again, this is maybe a slide where I would write down these 4 things because this content's pretty on point. And I use this sometimes when I'm struggling, especially with management, especially if you're doing something where you're in an adversarial advocating position like a oral reply or grievance. Number 1 is to be able to see the world as others see it. So this is really, the phrase of, oh, well, are you able to walk in someone else's shoes? Are you able to be in someone else's shoes? But what I think often people forget about that is not as you, as them, meaning that if I put myself in someone else's shoes and then I use my strengths, my weaknesses, and my personal experience to judge what they're doing, then I'm doing the exact opposite of empathy. If I'm able to say, wow, if this was me, and I had a manager that was difficult, and I just started at this agency a year ago, and I put their context to their situation, that is empathy. If I say, well, when I was here and I was a new employee, I didn't have this problem, that is judgment. And that's what she's saying with number two. Number two is incredibly hard. Probably the most challenging part of empathy is not to judge someone else's experience. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you can't make any judgments, but you don't want to be making a judgment that's creating a trust break. So for example, a pretty common one is that sometimes employees come to the union saying that they believe they've been discriminated against. At the end of the day, I need to acknowledge that whether it's true under the law or true in my own eyes, that they believe that they were discriminated against. That is the first part of empathy. So it doesn't mean I can't make a judgment about the case or about the merits or anything like that, but it does mean that I don't get to tell them how they should feel. I need to understand that. And so one of the best phrases I use, especially for managers that are difficult at the port director level, at the APD level, where we just constantly are butting heads, I say things like, this may not be true for the union or for me, but I have to acknowledge it's true for them. So if management says, oh, well, we can't do this schedule because of this staffing problem, sometimes I try to show them they don't have that staffing problem. But sometimes what's the most effective way to use my relationship to push past the issue is to say, okay, if I were management and I felt a concern about staffing, where is that coming from? They feel like in case of an emergency, they can't have the amount of staff they need. So then I can come up with a solution or alternative to address their interest or their problem. If I had just said, well, that staffing problem is ridiculous, that's not real, I lose the opportunity to find a creative solution that meets their feelings and their interests without judging them. What Brene also talks about in number 3 is that you have to be vulnerable and you have to build your emotional awareness. So if someone's going to talk to you about a time that they felt they're feeling depressed or anxious or overwhelmed by work, what is going to help you empathize with them is not necessarily that same factual scenario, but finding another time in your recollection that you shared that feeling, even if that feeling was created by another thing. So in this work, you hear of incredibly tragic circumstances. And so to make sure you're not breaking trust, you don't want to say like, oh, I'm sorry that let's use a case I have right now. I'm sorry that your father is dying from stage 4 cancer and you want to get this hardship transfer to be with him, to care for him. Like the end. If I say that, that's a compassion trust break, right? They don't think I understand that. But if I say, wow, I understand what that feels like. I actually have a very close friend who's struggling with a terminal illness, and I know that my desires to be near them are so strong. I can't imagine what you're feeling. That is an empathetic response, even if my father doesn't have terminal cancer and I've never been in that position and I don't work at CBP. So it's all about connecting with the same feeling, but that requires you to be vulnerable and acknowledge that you have these feelings, and also to be emotionally aware enough to know when you felt them and to invoke them. And that's part of the communication part, right? To be able to say this in a tone, a body language, and with words that the message goes through. If you just say like, oh, I'm sorry, that's terrible, that's the content. The tone doesn't suggest empathy. The body language doesn't suggest empathy. Of course, in this environment, we're not like putting our hands on people's shoulders as much or doing any of these body language signals, but for sure in tone and content, we can be communicating empathy. Next slide, please. So here are some tools. I don't want to just talk about empathy and tell you about the qualities. Here are a couple of things that are shown to work. One is called the like me practice. Very simple. If you're struggling to build empathy with an employee, a manager, a fellow leader, somebody on the opposite side of the table of you in management, start by saying like me. So for example, I've been in many meetings where management comes in a bad mood, they're difficult. I had a new port director who was very insecure and was making a lot of fear-based decisions. So every time I engaged with that person, instead of making it personal, I tried to say things like me, this manager had a bad day. Like me, this manager didn't sleep well last night. Like me, this manager is new in their job and trying to build confidence and build credibility, and they're just responding to what I'm saying instead of doing what's best for employees. And it just is a grounding practice to remind you that we all have more in common than we have differences. And it's the tapping into that commonality that helps build bridges, like so many of you that express that in your why. The other thing is really important is to avoid subtle acts of exclusion. When you're talking to somebody about their opinion or your opinion of their opinion using I, not you, it's really common in vernacular to just say like, when this happens, you do this or you do that. And the idea is that we're sharing that experience. But what often happens is you're invalidating somebody else's experience. That's not true for them. And by you saying you've made them feel like you don't get it. So speak from I. I usually say like, I can only speak for myself, or for me, when I experience this, this is what I do, instead of saying that I know what they're experiencing. So that's a practice I try to use as well. Form is a more regimented way of doing it. It's about opening conversations in ways that build empathy. So asking people about their family, if they have kids, what family situation they're in. Obviously, you can talk to them about what they do at work. You're in a work role. This is not just for union work. This is for empathy outside of that as well. Recreation, talking to them about what they want to do to have fun. But the mindset one is really important. Right? Like, how are you feeling? How are you feeling about working at CBP? How are you liking it here? How are you not liking it here? Those are the conversations that are gateways to stronger empathy. So that is the end of our content. There's one thing I'll point to you in the participant guide is page 18, Keys to Bringing Positive Change to the Workplace. It has a lot of really positive tools and framing for you about how you can continue to be a positive impact in the workplace over time. It's in our keepers, as well as some basics on formal meetings and what's considered a formal meeting, and some basic simplified decision making for how you can be an advocate. So I wanted to direct your attention to that. But we have 2 more minutes, and I wanted to make sure, oh yeah, nice shout out from Brene Brown's Daring Greatly. Is really, really great. Yes, I love that as well. It is time for lunch now in the next minute. You guys have 45 minutes to return from lunch. I hope you've enjoyed this course. For those who want to answer questions in the chat, Samira and I can stay for a few minutes before we take a formal break. So thank you so much. It's so weird that I can't see or hear you guys, but I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope that you take some keys, and I hope you have a great rest of your training. Samira, if you want to unmute, can you highlight some of the questions you were seeing?
Sure. There were a couple questions that I thought might be useful to bring out because, like I mentioned in the chat earlier, it seems like the answers are being reordered, but the first question I wanted to just highlight was Randy asked if Jen had mentioned earlier that when we are representing a union member, that we are officers, that you are as officers equal to management. And he asked if he's understanding that correctly. And the answer to that is yes. When you are acting in your capacity as a representative for employees, you are absolutely equal to management. And of course, that entails acting with professionalism, acting with respect, but at the same time, you should feel free to push back because you are equal to management in that capacity. And then the other couple questions I just wanted to mention were, Dora asked if you are allowed to wear your pins as NTEU steward, and the answer is yes. Article 44 addresses that, and I actually included the specific section of the CBA that addresses that, but you are allowed to wear your pin to identify you. Obviously, this is more applicable when people are in the office and can see you, but to the extent that you have the pin and can identify yourself as a steward, you are absolutely allowed to do that. And just note, under Article 44, there are requirements around where you're supposed to wear the pin, but otherwise you are allowed to do so. And then the last question I just wanted to highlight was the longer question from Robert, which is, what is the best way to deal with the defensive manager? And I think this question is a really good one in that it incorporates, answering the question will allow you to incorporate a lot of the things that we've talked about today, because a defensive manager can be the result of a lot of different factors, right? It can be the result of a strained relationship between the union and management. It could be a result of, something going on specifically with the manager, perhaps in their personal life or in their work life. And not that it's necessarily your responsibility to delve into that with management in particular, but you'll see in the chat that I suggested, first, think about the relationship with management. That's always something that we want to think about. Are there ways to, strengthen that relationship so we can resolve things at the lowest level? But if you're finding that things are still contentious, I would highly encourage you to talk to your chapter, reach out to the people that are around you that have experience, that are doing the same things that you're doing. Reach out to your field rep. We often have ideas about the best ways to approach situations. Sometimes if it means going through the grievance process, going through litigation, that's what we have to do, because management is violating the contract and refuses to see that they're doing something wrong. But I would just highly encourage you to lean on the people around you and use all these tools in the toolbox that we're talking about to, try and address that situation creatively. So I'll leave it at that, Jen. Those were the questions that stuck out to me.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for everyone's meaningful engagement. I'm following up with a few in the chat. Enjoy your break. I know it was a long session, but we're hoping we'll see you in 45 minutes for your session with the national president.